Welcome back. If you are new here, this channel is a quiet place set aside for long, slow history told without urgency, without noise, without anything rushing you toward the end. My name does not matter much. What matters is that you have found your way here, that you are settling in somewhere comfortable, and that the world outside your window, whatever it holds tonight, is already beginning to feel a little farther away. That is the whole point of this. These stories are not meant to excite you. They are meant to carry you gently across the distance between wakefulness and sleep, the way a slow river carries a leaf, without effort, without destination in mind, just the soft movement of water and time. Tonight, we are going to spend a very long while together, exploring one of the most extraordinary and least remembered stories in the entire sweep of American history. It is the story of a small people in a volcanic landscape, of a war that should never have happened, of a trial that changed everything, and of a nation that forgot what it had done almost before the dust had settled. So close your eyes if you like, let your breathing slow. And if you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. There is a place in the far northern reaches of what we now call California, just where that state bleeds quietly into the high desert of southern Oregon, where the land does something that is difficult to describe unless you have stood there yourself and felt it underfoot. The earth becomes strange. It buckles and heaves and cracks open in ways that speak of very old violence, of fire that moved beneath the crust of the world long before any human being walked this continent. Lava fields stretch out across the plateau in frozen waves, black and rough and ancient, broken here and there by shallow lakes that reflect the enormous sky, and by stands of juniper and sage that cling to the soil wherever soil can be found. The winters are brutal in this place. The wind comes down from the north without anything to stop it, gathering speed across the Oregon Plateau until it hits the lava beds and the shallow lake basins and the rim rock cliffs with a force that makes the cold feel personal, as though the season itself has decided to test whatever lives here. And yet things do live here. They always have. Long before any map was drawn, long before any government claimed jurisdiction over this particular piece of the earth, long before the word America meant anything at all, a people made their home in this difficult and beautiful landscape. They called themselves the Maclacs. We know them by the name their neighbors gave them, the Modoc. The Modoc were not a large people in terms of numbers. Estimates of their population, before sustained contact with outsiders, placed them somewhere between 400 and 800 individuals, perhaps a little more in the years of particular abundance. But the size of a people has never had much to do with the depth of their story, and the Modoc had a story that went back a very long way indeed. They had lived along the shores of Tule Lake and Lower Klamath Lake for generations beyond any counting that survives in the historical record. They knew every fold of the lava beds. They knew which passages through the twisted rock led somewhere useful, and which ones ended in nothing, in walls of stone that went nowhere. They knew the fish in the lakes, the patterns of the waterfowl that came through in enormous numbers every season, the way the wind moved across the plateau, and what it meant when the sky turned a particular shade of grey in the late afternoon. This knowledge was not written down. It was carried in the minds of elders, in the stories told around fires, when the nights were long and cold, in the practical education of children who learned to move through this landscape the way their grandparents had, quietly and with great attention. Their society was organized around small family groups and bands, each one associated with a particular territory, a particular stretch of lakeshore, or a particular portion of the volcanic plateau. Leadership among the Modoc was not inherited in the way that European observers sometimes assumed. A leader, a chief in the language of outsiders, was a man who had demonstrated qualities that others wished to follow. He was a good hunter, or a skilled negotiator, or someone whose judgment had proven sound through many seasons. He could lose his influence as easily as he had gained it if he made poor decisions, or if the people around him decided that someone else was better suited to lead them through whatever difficulty the present moment held. This was a fluid and practical form of governance, well suited to a people who needed to respond quickly to the changing demands of their environment, who could not afford the inefficiencies that came with rigid hierarchy. when the margin between a good season and a difficult one could be very thin. The landscape itself shaped everything about how the Modoc lived. Tule Lake, the great shallow body of water at the heart of their territory, was enormously productive. The lake was dense with fish, particularly the suckers that came up in predictable runs at certain times of year, and the Modoc had developed sophisticated techniques for harvesting them. They built weirs from tule reeds, the tall marsh grasses that gave the lake its name, and they drove the fish into enclosures where they could be taken in large quantities and dried for storage against the leaner months of winter. The tule reeds themselves were useful beyond measure. They were woven into mats that served as walls and roofing material for the semi-subterranean pit houses the Modoc built for winter habitation. They were made into baskets of extraordinary quality, the kind of tight weave that could hold water, that could serve as cooking vessels when hot stones were placed inside to bring the water to a boil. Every part of this landscape gave something, and the Modoc knew how to receive what it offered. They also traded. Trade networks across the interior West were ancient and complex, long before any European foot touched this continent, and the Modoc were embedded in those networks in ways that connected them to peoples and places far beyond the immediate territory of the lava beds. They traded dried fish and tule products northward to the Klamath, with whom they shared deep cultural and linguistic roots, and they maintained relationships with groups to the south and east, exchanging goods and information across distances that might seem surprising given the difficulty of travel across this terrain. And they raided. This is a part of the Modoc story that their later admirers sometimes wish to minimize, because it complicates the simple narrative of the innocent victim, but honesty requires acknowledging it. The Modoc conducted raids on neighboring peoples, particularly groups to the south and west in California, taking horses, goods, and occasionally captives who were either adopted into Modoc society or exchanged. This was not unique to the Modoc. It was part of the broader pattern of intergroup relations across much of the interior West, a pattern of exchange and conflict and negotiation that had its own logic and its own long history. What matters, as we move deeper into this story, is that the Modoc were a competent and self-sufficient people who understood their world in great depth and had organized their lives in ways that worked within the particular constraints and possibilities of the volcanic plateau. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were not suspended in some static prehistory, unchanged and unchanging. They were people with politics and personalities and disagreements and alliances, people whose world was already complicated before the first wagon wheel left a track across the Applegate Trail, before the first American surveyor looked at their lakes and their lava beds and began to imagine what might be done with them. The Applegate Trail, that is where the complications begin in earnest. Though the complications, if we are honest, had been building since the first Spanish expeditions moved through California's Central Valley, since the fur trappers and mountain men who came through this region in the 1820s and 1830s brought with them the first signs of a world that was moving toward the Modoc from a very great distance. Peter Skene Ogden of the Hudson's Bay Company passed through this region in the winter of 1826 and 1827, moving through the lava bed country on a trapping expedition that left almost nothing behind except a few lines in a journal and the faint impression of hoofprints in the volcanic soil that filled with snow and disappeared. John C. Fremont came through in 1846, mapping and observing and writing the kinds of descriptions that made the East Coast believe this was a country worth having. But it was the trail that changed everything. The Applegate Trail, also called the South Emigrant Trail, was developed in 1846 by Jesse and Lindsay Applegate as an alternative to the Oregon Trail's treacherous final descent of the Blue Mountains. It swung south, cutting through the Klamath and Modoc country, and along its length, for several years, beginning in the late 1840s and accelerating dramatically after gold was discovered in California in 1848. Thousands of emigrants passed through the Modoc homeland. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Wagons and oxen and cattle and the accumulated material of families making desperate, hopeful, exhausting journeys toward a new life. They moved through a landscape that belonged to people they could barely see, whose presence they registered mostly as a potential threat. whose existence made the journey feel more dangerous, regardless of whether any actual confrontation occurred. The early interactions between the Modoc and the emigrants along the Applegate Trail were mixed in the way that early interactions almost always are. There were trades, cautious exchanges of food for goods. There were moments of apparent friendliness, of curiosity on both sides, and there were incidents. The emigrants brought animals that competed with the game the Modoc hunted. They drove away or killed the deer and the antelope. Their cattle cropped the grasses that supported the ecosystem of the plateau. Some emigrants were attacked by Modoc warriors, and some of those attacks were lethal. Some of those attacks were responses to genuine provocations, to the theft of Modoc horses or the killing of Modoc people. Some of them were not. The violence that characterized the early contact period in the Oregon and California territories was chaotic and frequently impossible to trace back to any clear originating cause. It was the violence of two worlds, making contact in ways that neither had chosen and that neither fully understood. What the Modoc understood, perhaps more quickly and more clearly than any abstract analysis might suggest, was that these people moving through their country were not going away. Unlike the trappers who came and went with the seasons, unlike the traders who appeared and disappeared, the emigrants were going somewhere. They were headed somewhere beyond the Modoc's horizon, and they kept coming, a river of people that did not stop, that seemed to have no end. The Modoc elders watching from the rim rock above the trail could not have known the numbers that would eventually pass, could not have understood the scale of what was building in the territories to the east from which these people came, but they could count. And what the counting told them was that the balance of things was shifting in ways that would require a response. The man who would eventually give that response its most famous shape was born somewhere around 1837, though the year is uncertain, as years of birth often are for people whose births were not recorded in ledgers or church registers. His Modoc name was Kintpuash, though it was spelled many different ways by the Americans who eventually came to know him, and he would become known to American newspapers and military dispatches and history books by the name Captain Jack. The origin of that name has its own small history. He wore a jacket decorated with brass buttons, the story goes, a piece of clothing acquired through trade, and someone at some point began calling him Captain Jack, the kind of casual nickname that was freely applied to native leaders throughout this period, names that had nothing to do with the people themselves and everything to do with the ease of American tongues that could not or would not shape themselves around Kintpuash. The name stuck, as such names did, and it is by that name that most of the written record knows him. So it is by that name that this story will sometimes use, while trying to remember, as the story goes on, that behind the name was a man of considerable complexity, a man caught in one of the most difficult positions that history has ever placed a human being. Captain Jack was, by the accounts that survive, a man of medium height and compact build, with a face that observers described variously as dignified, or proud, or stubborn, depending on whether the observer was disposed to admire him or not. He was a skilled hunter and a competent warrior, as any Modoc man of his generation was expected to be. But what distinguished him from others was a quality that is harder to name, a kind of political intelligence, an ability to read the situation of his people within the larger situation of the continent with a clarity that few around him possessed, and that would, in the end, make him dangerous in ways that military skill alone never could have. He was not the most warlike of the Modoc leaders. There were others around him who were more immediately aggressive, more eager to fight. What made Captain Jack remarkable was that he understood, on some level, that the choices his people faced were not simply military choices. They were political and moral and existential choices, and the ground beneath those choices was never stable, never quite what it appeared to be. He had been to Eureka. That is worth noting. Eureka was a mining town in Northern California, established in the early 1850s during the gold rush and growing quickly into a rough and busy commercial center. Captain Jack had spent time there in the late 1850s, had learned some English, had dealt with American merchants and officials, had begun to develop an understanding of the American world that went beyond what could be gathered from watching wagons roll along a trail. He saw the scale of the American enterprise. He saw the towns being built and the roads being cut and the land being divided and claimed, he came back to his people with a knowledge that was both useful and painful. Useful because it told him things he needed to know to navigate what was coming, and painful because what it told him about what was coming was not reassuring. The California legislature had passed an act in 1850 that said something quite direct about its intentions toward the native peoples of the state. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which was in practice neither governmental nor protective in any meaningful sense, allowed for the indenture of native people to white employers under conditions that differed from slavery, mainly in their formal structure. It allowed local authorities to arrest native people on vagrancy charges and to bind them out to work. It was, in its practical application, a mechanism for coerced labor of the most naked kind. And it was one piece of a larger pattern of legislation and policy and violence that was already, by the early 1850s, reducing the native population of California with shocking speed. Scholars who have studied this period carefully have concluded that the California Indian population, estimated at perhaps 150,000 in 1848, had fallen to fewer than 30,000 by 1870. The causes were multiple, a combination of disease, dispossession, starvation, and direct killing. Whatever word one chooses to apply to this process, its scale was enormous and its speed was catastrophic. Captain Jack, watching from the edge of this catastrophe, watching from the lava beds and the shores of Tule Lake, was trying to calculate how his people might survive it. That calculation would occupy the rest of his life. In 1851, a small party of Modoc warriors, their identities and their motivations not entirely clear in the historical record, attacked a wagon train on the Applegate Trail at a place that became known as Bloody Point on the eastern shore of Tule Lake. The attack killed or wounded a significant number of emigrants. The numbers reported varied wildly in the accounts that circulated afterward, as numbers in such reports almost always did, inflated by fear and distance and the desire to justify what came next. What came next was a retaliatory expedition organized by Ben Wright, a former mountain man and scout who had made a reputation in Northern California as someone willing to deal with the native threat in direct terms. Wright and his party of volunteers tracked and engaged a group of Modoc, and what followed was either a battle or a massacre, depending on whose account you read. Wright and his men killed somewhere between 30 and 40 Modoc, and in the immediate aftermath, the American press celebrated it as a necessary suppression of savage hostility. The Modoc understood it differently. They understood it as a killing of their people under conditions that had not been of their choosing, and the memory of it settled into the community's collective awareness the way such memories do, not as an abstraction but as a felt and personal thing, a wound that did not close. Ben Wright's expedition did not end Modoc resistance to the changes being imposed on their world. It could not have, because the changes were not slowing. The gold rush brought miners into the Klamath and Modoc country, as well as into the richer fields to the south, and the miners brought with them the appetites and assumptions of a culture that regarded the land as a resource to be extracted, and the people who had lived on that land as an inconvenience to be managed or removed. Conflicts continued through the 1850s, episodic and bitter, without resolution, because the underlying condition that produced them, the collision of two worlds, with fundamentally different ideas about land and sovereignty and the right to exist, was not being addressed by anything. It was simply generating incident after incident, each one leaving its residue of grief and anger and distrust, each one making the next one more likely. The federal government, watching all of this from Washington, had its own ideas about how the situation might be managed. Those ideas were organized around the concept of the reservation, a piece of ground set aside for native use, bounded and defined and administered by federal agents, theoretically protected from encroachment by non-native settlers, theoretically supplied with the goods and services needed to sustain the people relocated there. In theory, in practice, the reservation system, as it was implemented throughout the West in the mid-19th century, was a catastrophe of mismanagement, corruption, and broken promises that managed to be simultaneously too intrusive and too negligent, taking away the resources people had depended on without reliably providing the substitutes that had been promised in exchange. In 1864, a treaty was negotiated at Council Grove near the mouth of the Klamath River. The Modoc were present at this negotiation, represented by Old Shonchin, who was then the principal chief of the Modoc people. Captain Jack was also present, though his precise role in the deliberations is not entirely clear from the records that survive. What emerged from the Council Grove Treaty was an agreement, signed by representatives of the Modoc, the Klamath, and the Yahooskin Band of Paiute, that extinguished the tribe's land, claims to their traditional territories, in exchange for a shared reservation in the Upper Klamath Basin. The terms included promises of annual payments, farming equipment, livestock, and the services of a teacher and a blacksmith and a carpenter, all the infrastructure that the treaty makers believed would assist the transition to an agricultural way of life that the government assumed was the only viable future for native peoples in the American West. The Modoc signatories to this treaty were agreeing to give up everything: their lakes, their lava beds, the volcanic plateau that had been the world of their people since before any memory reached. They were agreeing to move north, away from the landscape they knew in every particular, and to share a reservation with the Klamath, with whom they had a complicated history that included both cultural similarity and long-standing rivalry and occasional violence. Whether they fully understood the implications of what they were agreeing to is a question that the historical record cannot definitively answer. Treaty negotiations in this period were conducted through interpreters of varying competence, in circumstances of significant power imbalance, with terms and conditions that were often explained imprecisely or not at all. It is reasonable to assume that the Modoc signatories understood that they were agreeing to some kind of arrangement involving shared land to the north. It is much less clear that they understood the full scope of what the treaty meant in American legal terms, what they were giving up, what they could and could not do on the land they would now be required to occupy. The removal from the lava bed country to the Klamath Reservation took place gradually over the period following the treaty, and it went badly from the beginning. The problems were multiple, and they compounded each other. The Klamath were the larger group on the shared reservation, and they were the home people, the ones who knew the land and had the established relationships with the agency staff. The Modoc arrived as newcomers in a place that was already someone else's territory, and the Klamath did not receive them as equals. There were disputes over resources, over the tule reeds that both groups used and that the Klamath claimed proprietary rights over. There were social tensions and outright confrontations. The agency staff, understaffed and overwhelmed, and frequently changed out as government appointments turned over with the political winds in Washington, managed these tensions poorly when they managed them at all. The promised supplies and equipment arrived late, or not at all, or in quantities insufficient for the number of people they were supposed to sustain. The farming that was supposed to replace the hunting and fishing of the traditional life required agricultural conditions that the Klamath Basin Reservation partially provided and partially did not, and the transition itself required skills and knowledge and time that were not adequately supported. Captain Jack watched all of this. He watched the situation on the reservation and he formed his assessment. His assessment was that this arrangement was not working, that the Modoc people were being diminished by it, that the promised benefits were not materializing, while the costs were very real and immediate, and that the situation on the reservation was producing a slow deterioration of his people's capacity to sustain themselves. He brought his concerns to the Indian agent. The agent heard them, and perhaps passed them along to his superiors, and perhaps did not. Nothing changed. The supplies remained inadequate. The tensions with the Klamath remained unresolved. The fishing rights, that were one of the most critical issues for the Modoc, who were fundamentally a fishing people, remained contested and unresolved. And so, in the spring of 1870, Captain Jack led a band of Modoc south, back to the lava beds, back to the shores of Tule Lake, back to the landscape they knew, the landscape that had made them, the landscape that the treaty they had signed had given away. He did not go back in defiance of anything, exactly. He went back because the alternative, staying on the Klamath Reservation under conditions that were slowly destroying the community he was responsible for, seemed to him worse than whatever consequences might come from returning to a home that was technically no longer theirs. There were roughly 200 Modoc people who went south with Captain Jack. They made camp on the Lost River, which drained out of Lower Klamath Lake and ran through the landscape they had lived in before the treaty. They began to do the things they knew how to do. They fished and hunted. They gathered tule reeds. They maintained their relationships with the white settlers in the area, some of whom were relatively comfortable with the Modoc presence, some of whom were not. The Eureka newspapers, which followed Modoc affairs with close attention, reported on the situation in tones that ranged from sympathetic to alarmed. The Indian Bureau in Washington was notified that the Modoc had left the reservation. The machinery of federal Indian policy began, slowly, to consider what should be done. What should be done, in the view of T.B. O'Donnell, who was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon in this period, was straightforward. The Modoc had agreed to live on the Klamath Reservation. They had left it without permission. They should be compelled to return. The question was only how that compulsion should be applied, and whether it should be the Civilian Indian Bureau that applied it or the military. Before that question was resolved, there were negotiations. Alfred Meacham, who was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs before O'Donnell, and who knew the Modoc better than most of the officials involved in their management, came south to meet with Captain Jack in the spring of 1871. The conversations he had were long, and the concerns they surfaced were real. Captain Jack laid out his grievances carefully. The Klamath people were hostile, the supplies were insufficient, the reservation land was not as productive as had been promised. The Modoc could sustain themselves better here on Lost River than they could on the reservation. He did not want to fight anyone. He wanted to be left alone in the country his people knew. Meacham was sympathetic, perhaps more sympathetic than his position required him to be. He wrote to Washington recommending that a small reservation be established for the Modoc on Lost River within their traditional territory, a solution that would cost the government relatively little and that might resolve the situation peacefully. Washington considered this. Washington consulted the concerns of settlers who had moved into the Lost River Valley and who did not want a reservation next door. Washington consulted the political implications of appearing to reward the Modoc for leaving the reservation without permission. Washington did not, in the end, act on Meacham's recommendation. The situation continued. Captain Jack's band remained on Lost River. The tension between the Modoc presence and the growing settler population in the surrounding area continued to generate friction. Livestock was said to be missing. Crops were said to be damaged. Whether these reports were accurate, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated in some cases, is impossible to know with certainty from the distance of a century and a half. What is certain is that the settler community was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the Modoc presence and increasingly vocal in expressing that discomfort to officials who had reason to listen. There was a second Modoc leader during this period who demands our attention, because without understanding him, the shape of what is coming cannot be fully grasped. His name was Hooker Jim. He was a warrior, younger than Captain Jack, more aggressive, less patient with the politics of negotiation. Hooker Jim had his own following within the broader Modoc community, his own band, his own perspective on what the situation required. Where Captain Jack was calculating and careful, Hooker Jim was more willing to act on anger. They were not enemies, these two men. They shared a community and, to some degree, a purpose. But they did not always agree on method, and the differences between them would become one of the defining dynamics of the catastrophe that was approaching. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, in late 1872, concluded that the situation on Lost River had gone on long enough. The Modoc must be returned to the Klamath Reservation. This was the decision, clearly stated, and the mechanism chosen to implement it was the United States Army. In November of 1872, a detachment of soldiers under Captain James Jackson rode south from Fort Klamath with orders to return the Modoc to the reservation, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. They arrived at Captain Jack's camp on the morning of the 29th of November, 1872, before dawn had fully broken over the lava beds. The exact sequence of events in the moments that followed is disputed in the sources, as it almost inevitably would be. What is not disputed is that gunfire broke out, that men on both sides were wounded in the initial exchange, and that the confrontation that the Indian Bureau had hoped might be managed peacefully became instead the opening engagement of a war. In the chaos of that morning, Hooker Jim and his band, fleeing along the eastern shore of Tule Lake, killed a number of settlers, somewhere between 12 and 15, men who had nothing directly to do with the military confrontation at Captain Jack's camp, but who were in the path of the fleeing warriors, and who died in the violence of that morning's confusion and fear and rage. Those killings, Hooker Jim's killings, would change everything about what followed. They placed the Modoc outside the possibility of any negotiated settlement that involved simple surrender. They made any peace conditional on the delivery of those responsible for the settlers' deaths. And that condition was one that Captain Jack could not meet without fracturing his people, because Hooker Jim and his warriors were part of his community, and handing them over was not something he was willing to contemplate. The killings also ensured that the army's response would not be measured or patient. The settlers of the region had relatives among the dead. They had representatives in the state and federal governments who would demand action. The army would have to move, and it would have to move hard. Captain Jack led his people into the lava beds, into the natural fortress that the volcanic landscape provided, into a maze of trenches and tunnels and ridges and pressure ridges that the Modoc had known since childhood, a landscape they could move through in darkness with confidence, while any outsider who entered it was immediately, dangerously lost. They took their horses, what supplies they had, their weapons. They went into the lava beds with roughly 50 to 60 fighting men, and perhaps as many as 150 to 160 women, children, and elders. They built their defenses in the most defensible section of the lava beds, a place the army would eventually call the Stronghold, a natural fortress of twisted rock and sheltered depressions that gave them fields of fire over the surrounding terrain and cover from any direction of attack. The army surrounded them. Over the following months, the force assembled against the Modoc would grow to several hundred soldiers, supported by supply trains and artillery. Against this force, in the cold volcanic wilderness south of Tule Lake, 50 to 60 Modoc warriors held the United States Army at a standstill for 6 months. That fact, the raw fact of those numbers, and that duration, requires a moment to register. 50 warriors, 6 months, an army of several hundred. The imbalance is so extreme that it seems, from this distance, almost fictional, like something from a story designed to make a point, rather than from the actual unfolding of history. But it happened, and understanding why it happened requires understanding the lava beds. The lava beds of Northern California are the product of volcanic activity that was ancient even before the Modoc arrived, and that left behind a landscape unlike almost anything else on the North American continent. The surface is rough beyond easy description. The rock is not smooth. It is broken and jagged, and full of the kind of edges that tear through boot leather and skin and the soles of feet with equal efficiency. Moving across it at any speed, for anyone who has not spent years learning its patterns, is an exercise in constant difficulty. You cannot run. You cannot march in formation. You cannot deploy cavalry across this terrain with any effect. You cannot easily bring artillery to bear on a position that is concealed below the surface of the rock, in the natural trenches that the cooling lava created as it contracted and settled and fractured. And the Modoc had these natural trenches. The lava beds were full of them. Long, sinuous depressions in the rock that served as ready-made defensive works that allowed a fighter to move from one position to another without ever exposing himself above the horizon of the surrounding rock. They had their natural caves, some of them quite extensive, where water could be stored and where the wounded could be sheltered. They had sight lines that extended for great distances across the open terrain between the lava beds and the army's positions, so that any attack had to cross open ground under observation before it reached the cover of the rocks. The Modoc had time to study the terrain while they waited for the army's move, and they used that time to prepare their positions, to cache water, to identify the places where any attacking force would be most vulnerable. The first major army assault on the Modoc stronghold came in January of 1873. It was a two-pronged attack, with soldiers advancing from opposite sides of the lava beds, intended to squeeze the Modoc between them. It was a catastrophe. The fog that morning was thick enough to disorient the attacking columns, and the lava beds themselves, entirely unfamiliar to the soldiers moving through them, broke apart the formations that were the basis of army tactics. Men found themselves isolated, unable to see their comrades, unable to maintain direction, stumbling across broken rock, while Modoc warriors, who knew every inch of the terrain, moved with fluid ease from position to position, appearing and disappearing in ways that made it impossible to establish where they were, or how many of them there were. When the smoke and the fog cleared, the army had suffered roughly 40 casualties, killed and wounded. The Modoc had suffered none that can be confirmed in the historical record. It is difficult, from a distance, not to be struck by the skill and the courage that this outcome represents. 50 warriors, defending their families on land that was their home, had broken and repulsed an attack by a force that outnumbered them many times over. This was not luck. This was the outcome of deep knowledge of a specific landscape, of disciplined fire discipline, of fighting on ground that maximized every advantage the Modoc possessed, and neutralized every advantage the army brought to bear. The men who fought in the stronghold that morning were, in the most literal sense, defending everything they had left. Their families were a few hundred yards behind them. There was nowhere else to go. The fighting that followed that kind of motivation is not the same as the fighting that comes from discipline and training alone. The army regrouped. Reinforcements were requested. Supplies were reorganized. The command was changed. The public back east, reading about this small war in the volcanic wilderness of Northern California, was alternately shocked by the army's failures and fascinated by the situation. The newspapers covered the conflict with great attention. Correspondents traveled to Northern California to file dispatches from near the scene of operations. The Modoc stronghold became, for a few months in 1873, one of the most discussed military situations in the United States. In Washington, officials who had been paying little attention to the specific circumstances of the Modoc situation began to pay more. The peace policy, as it was called under the administration of President Ulysses Grant, was an attempt to replace the frankly violent and chaotic Indian management of earlier administrations with something more systematically humane. The idea was to place the administration of Indian reservations in the hands of religious groups, particularly the Quakers, who were thought to be honest and free from the corruption that had plagued the earlier system, and to pursue the incorporation of native peoples into American society through peaceful means, through education and religious conversion and agricultural training. It was still a policy of dispossession and cultural erasure, but it preferred to accomplish those things without overt violence. And here, in the lava beds of Northern California, the peace policy was being directly challenged by a situation that seemed to require overt violence and was not going well. The decision was made to attempt negotiation. A peace commission was assembled, and the man chosen to lead it was Alfred Meacham, the former superintendent who had recommended the Lost River Reservation years earlier, who knew the Modoc, and who had their limited trust. The commission also included Reverend Eleazar Thomas, a Methodist minister with no particular experience in Indian affairs, but a genuine belief in the power of persuasion and good faith, and L.S. Dyer, the Indian agent for the Klamath Reservation. They set up camp near the lava beds and began the slow and difficult process of opening a channel of communication with Captain Jack. The negotiations that followed, conducted through emissaries who moved back and forth between the Peace Commission's tent and the Modoc stronghold, were a study in miscommunication and impossible positions. Captain Jack wanted a reservation on Lost River. The Peace Commission could not promise him that, because they did not have the authority to make such a promise, and because the political environment in Washington and in Oregon and California would not have sustained such a promise even if they had made it. The Peace Commission wanted the Modoc to surrender and return to the reservation. Captain Jack could not agree to that without surrendering the men who had killed the settlers on the east shore of Two Lake, and he would not do that because those men were his people. The positions were not compatible. They could not be made compatible by goodwill alone. Within the Modoc camp, Captain Jack was under pressure from multiple directions. There were warriors, particularly a group that included Hooker Jim and a man named Curly-Headed Doctor, a shaman of considerable influence, who believed that negotiation was futile, that the Americans could not be trusted, that the only option was to fight to the last. Curly-headed Doctor had performed ceremonies intended to protect the Modoc warriors in battle, had told them that the red-painted rope strung around the perimeter of the stronghold would prevent soldiers from crossing it, had built his people's confidence through ritual and vision, as well as through the practical evidence of their military success so far. His influence, and Hooker Jim's, pushed against Captain Jack's more cautious political judgment at every point. There was an idea that began to circulate in the Modoc camp in March of 1873, an idea so desperate in its implications that it is difficult to know how seriously Captain Jack himself took it, or whether he embraced it, or resisted it, or simply found himself unable to prevent it from taking shape around him. The idea was this: if the peace commissioners were killed during the negotiations, if the Americans who were coming to talk were killed in the act of talking, the war would escalate in ways that might change the fundamental calculation. The attention of the nation would be seized. The Modoc would become impossible to ignore. Perhaps other tribes would join them. Perhaps the killing of peace commissioners would create enough moral and political disruption in Washington to produce an outcome that simple military stalemate was not producing. Captain Jack opposed this idea, by all the accounts that survive, including those of Modoc survivors who spoke about these events years later. He argued against it. He pointed out that killing men who came to talk would mark the Modoc as oath breakers, as people who could not be negotiated with under any circumstances, and that the consequence would not be the escalation of the war in the Modoc's favor, but the hardening of the army's resolve to destroy them entirely. He was right. He was completely right. His analysis of the situation was accurate in every particular, and he was overruled. There is a detail in the accounts of what happened next that has stayed with writers and historians ever since, a small human detail that illuminates the nature of the trap that was closing around Captain Jack. At some point in the deliberations within the Modoc camp, in the days before the meeting that would change everything, the warriors who wanted to kill the peace commissioners brought Captain Jack a woman's garments and said to him, in words that have been reported in various versions, that if he would not do what needed to be done, he could dress as a woman. It was a profound insult within Modoc cultural understanding, a challenge to his masculinity and his fitness to lead, delivered by men who were also his people, who were also depending on him, who were also trapped in the same impossible situation. Whether or not the exact words and gestures reported in later accounts are entirely accurate, the dynamic they represent was real. Captain Jack was being forced toward an action he knew was wrong by people he could not abandon, in a situation that had no good outcomes in any direction. The meeting was scheduled for the 11th of April, 1873. The peace commissioners would come to a tent set up in the neutral ground between the Modoc stronghold and the army positions, and they would talk with Captain Jack and other Modoc leaders. The commissioners came unarmed, or largely so. They came in good faith. Alfred Meacham and Reverend Thomas and L.S. Dyer, accompanied by a Modoc woman named Toby Riddle, who served as an interpreter, and her husband Frank Riddle, who was a white settler who had married into the Modoc community. Toby Riddle knew what was planned. She had heard enough in the days before the meeting to understand what was intended, and she tried to warn the commissioners. She told them not to go. They went anyway. Captain Jack came to the meeting with a group of warriors that included Hooker Jim and Boston Charlie and Shonchin John and others, all of them armed beneath their blankets. The conversation began. It went the way conversations had been going for months, with Captain Jack pressing for a reservation on Lost River and the commissioners explaining that they could not promise this. And then, at some signal that the accounts do not entirely agree on, Captain Jack drew a pistol and shot Alfred Meacham's commanding officer, General Canby, who had been added to the commission. The shot killed Canby. It was the first killing of a United States general in combat since the Civil War. In the same moments, Boston Charlie killed Reverend Thomas. L.S. Dyer managed to run and was wounded, but survived. Alfred Meacham was shot and left for dead, but survived, his life saved, by many accounts, by Toby Riddle, who shouted a warning or intervened at the critical moment. Frank Riddle survived by running. The killing of General Canby and Reverend Thomas electrified the country. Whatever sympathy there had been for the Modoc situation, whatever voices had called for peaceful resolution and a just settlement were now largely drowned out by the demand for punishment. President Grant, upon receiving the news, authorized the army to proceed with all necessary force. The commander on the ground was replaced with a man named Jefferson C. Davis, not the Confederate president, but a Union Army general who was not encumbered by any sympathy for the Modoc, and who had at his disposal, by this point, a force of several hundred soldiers with artillery. Captain Jack had been right. The killing of the peace commissioners had not changed the calculation in the Modoc's favor. It had simplified the question for the army, and for Washington, and for the public, in ways that made everything harder and nothing easier. The Modoc were now, unambiguously in the public mind, murderers who had killed men who came in peace, and whatever complexity had attached to their situation before April 11 was now buried under the weight of that act. But the fighting continued. The army pressed its advantage with renewed intensity, and the Modoc fought back with the same desperate competence they had shown throughout the winter. The stronghold held. The lava beds remained a nightmare of terrain for any attacking force. For another month after the killing of the peace commissioners, the Modoc held out in a situation that grew increasingly desperate, as their ammunition dwindled and their water supply became more difficult to maintain, and the pressure of constant military presence wore on the community. What finally undid the Modoc resistance was not a military defeat in any traditional sense. It was internal fracture. In late April, a group of warriors led by Hooker Jim, under pressure from the military's increasing effectiveness, slipped away from the stronghold and eventually surrendered. And then, in an act that must be understood as either pragmatic survival or betrayal depending on one's perspective, Hooker Jim and the others who had surrendered agreed to guide the army to Captain Jack's location. The men who had pushed Captain Jack toward the killing of the peace commissioners, who had shamed him into it with the threat of feminine humiliation, who had told him that negotiation was weakness and that killing was the only path, turned around and guided the soldiers to where he was hiding. Captain Jack was captured on the 1st of June, 1873, in the southern lava beds, exhausted and nearly without resources, surrounded by the remnants of his band. The accounts of his capture quote him as saying something that has been repeated in many versions of his story, something along the lines that his legs had given out and he could no longer fight. Whether those were his exact words, or a translation, or an approximation, the image they convey is accurate. He had been fighting, in every sense, for years, negotiating, arguing, resisting, refusing, and finally fighting with guns when every other option had been exhausted. Now that too was over. He was brought in. He was placed under guard. And now began the final and perhaps most extraordinary chapter of the Modoc story. A chapter that takes place not in the lava beds, but in a courtroom, and that raises questions about law and sovereignty and the rights of people at war that were not resolved in 1873 and that are not entirely resolved today. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Grant administration to try Captain Jack and several other Modoc leaders by a military tribunal for the murder of General Canby and Reverend Thomas. This decision was not uncontested. There were lawyers and advocates who argued that the proper venue for such a trial was a civil court, that the defendants had the right to the protections that civil law provided. There were others who argued, with considerable force and a degree of legal sophistication, that the military tribunal process itself rendered uncomfortable, that Captain Jack and the other Modoc leaders could not be tried for murder at all because they had been engaged in an act of war, a war recognized as such by the United States government itself, which had sent an army to fight them. And in war, the killing of enemy officers, however dishonorably accomplished, was not murder in the legal sense. The peace commissioners, including General Canby, had been present in a zone of active military operations. The meeting had taken place between armed opponents during an ongoing military conflict. The rules of war, as they were understood in 1873, did not straightforwardly apply to this situation, and the attempt to apply civil criminal law seemed to many observers to be a way of bypassing the complications by simply declaring them irrelevant. The military tribunal proceeded, regardless of these objections. It was convened at Fort Klamath in Oregon in July of 1873. Captain Jack and 5 other Modoc men Shonchin, John, Black Jim, Boston Charlie, Bancho, and Slowluck were charged with murder and with violation of the laws of war. The defense they were offered was inadequate in ways that were acknowledged even by some of the participants at the time. The proceedings were conducted in English, a language most of the defendants did not speak with any fluency. The interpretation was imperfect. The defendants were not given time to understand the charges or to consult with any advocate who might have helped them navigate the proceedings. The trial was brief. The outcome was not in serious doubt from the beginning. All 6 defendants were found guilty. The sentence was death. When the sentence was reviewed in Washington, President Grant commuted the sentences of Bancho and Slowluck to life imprisonment on grounds that were not entirely spelled out in the official record, perhaps because they were younger, perhaps because their roles in the killings had been considered somewhat less direct. Captain Jack, Shonchin John, Black Jim, and Boston Charlie were to hang. The execution was set for the 3rd of October, 1873. It was carried out at Fort Klamath. A large crowd gathered, soldiers and settlers and reporters, and pointedly, a group of Modoc people who had been brought to witness the execution. A deliberate and official gesture intended to demonstrate to the surviving Modoc the consequences of resistance. The gallows had been constructed in the fort's yard. The 4 condemned men were brought out, and in the accounts that survive of those final minutes, Captain Jack is described variously as dignified, as composed, as showing no outward sign of fear. He had made a speech the night before, or a statement, depending on which account you read, in which he said something about the injustice of his situation, about the land that had been taken, about the impossibility of the choices he had faced. The exact words vary too much across the sources to be quoted with confidence, but the sense of them is consistent across accounts. He knew he was being killed for something that the situation had made inevitable. He knew the men who had led him to it were alive and would remain so because they had been useful to the army. He knew the land was gone. The drop was not clean for one of the 4, by several accounts. The rope did not work as it should, and the death that followed was not quick. The other 3 died more quickly. When it was over, the bodies were cut down, and then, in a detail that is almost too dark to relate without pausing on it, the bodies of Captain Jack and Shonchin John were taken, in the days following the execution, and decapitated. Their heads were sent to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, where they were accessioned as specimens, as objects of scientific study under the pseudoscientific racial theories of the period that believed the physical characteristics of the skull could reveal the characteristics of the people to whom it had belonged. They were studied. They were labelled. They sat in a museum in the capital of the nation that had killed their owners. The rest of the surviving Modoc, approximately 150 people, were loaded onto wagons and transported to Baxter Springs in Kansas, and from there to the Quapaw Reservation in Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. They went as far from their volcanic homeland as it was possible to go while remaining on the North American continent. They went to a flat, damp landscape, utterly different from the dry volcanic plateau they had known, a place where the diseases that killed them at elevated rates could work efficiently in the humid air. They died in significant numbers in the years following the removal. They struggled to maintain their community, their language, their identity, in the conditions of exile and reduced numbers, and the grief that follows from the loss of everything. They were not entirely forgotten. Alfred Meacham, who had survived the killing on April 11 with significant wounds, who had been left for dead on the lava beds, who bore for the rest of his life the physical marks of that morning, became one of the most vigorous advocates for the Modoc people after the war. He wrote a book about the conflict. He took Toby and Frank Riddle on a lecture tour of the East Coast, presenting the Modoc story to audiences who had read about the war in the newspapers and who were, by this point, capable of a certain sympathy, the sympathy that is easier to feel for people who have been defeated and punished than the more complicated sympathy required when the situation is still contested. His advocacy was genuine and imperfect in equal measure, shaped by the assumptions of his time, even as it pushed against some of those assumptions. The surviving Modoc in Oklahoma held on to themselves as best they could. They maintained their community. They produced leaders, younger men and women, who were born in exile, but who carried the knowledge of where they had come from. In 1909, after decades of petition and negotiation, a group of Modoc people was allowed to return to the Klamath Reservation in Oregon, not to the lava beds, not to the Lost River country, but to the reservation they had left in 1870, the one they had found intolerable. Some of the Oklahoma Modoc chose to return, others stayed. The community was formally divided between Oregon and Oklahoma, a division that persists in some formal sense to this day. The lava beds themselves became a national monument in 1925. Lava Beds National Monument, administered by the National Park Service, preserves the volcanic landscape and the historical sites of the Modoc War. Visitors can walk through the stronghold today, can look out across the terrain that Captain Jack's warriors defended, can stand in the places where the army's attacks broke against the rock and the stubborn competence of 50 fighting men. The park's interpretive materials have become, over the decades, increasingly careful about how they present the Modoc perspective, increasingly willing to acknowledge the complexity of what happened here and the justice of many of the Modoc grievances that preceded the fighting. But the lava beds are quiet now. The volcano that made them, Medicine Lake Volcano, which is one of the largest shield volcanoes in the continental United States, sits largely dormant behind the flows that created this landscape. The tule reeds still grow at the edges of Tule Lake, though the lake itself is much reduced from its 19th century extent by the draining projects that converted the lake bottom to farmland in the early 20th century, an irony that requires a moment to absorb. The land that the Modoc were removed from was taken not so that it could be used as it was, as a rich and productive wetland ecosystem, but so that it could be transformed into something else entirely, drained and ploughed and made to produce the agricultural crops that the 19th century believed were the only legitimate use of any landscape. The Modoc people today are organized into two federally recognized tribes. The Klamath tribes, in Oregon, include the Modoc among their constituent groups, though the Modoc portion of the Confederation has sometimes had complicated relationships with the Klamath majority within that governmental structure. The Modoc tribe of Oklahoma maintains its own tribal government and its own cultural programs, keeping alive the language and the traditions and the memory of the volcanic plateau that was the homeland of their ancestors. The language is the thing that is perhaps most at risk. Modoc, which is closely related to Klamath and belongs to the Plateau-Penutian language family, has very few fluent speakers remaining as of the early 21st century, and the work of language revitalization that both tribal communities have undertaken faces the demographic challenges that all language revitalization efforts face when the number of fluent speakers becomes small enough to make transmission genuinely difficult. Languages carry knowledge that cannot be fully translated into other tongues, knowledge of the specific landscape in which they developed, knowledge of relationships between living things that are encoded in vocabulary and grammar and metaphor in ways that resist transfer. When a language dies, that knowledge does not simply transfer to the language that replaces it. It becomes inaccessible in ways that are very difficult to recover. The Modoc War has been written about by historians with varying degrees of care and sympathy since it ended. The earliest accounts, produced by participants and observers in the years immediately after the fighting, were shaped by the assumptions of their moment. Assumptions about civilization and savagery, about the inevitability of American expansion, about the legal and moral right of the United States to do what it had done. These accounts are valuable as historical documents, while being sometimes painful to read as moral ones. Later historians, particularly those working in the second half of the 20th century, as the fields of Western history and Native American history underwent significant revisions, produced accounts that took the Modoc perspective more seriously, that read the documentary record more critically, that tried to understand what the Modoc had experienced and chosen, rather than simply what had happened to them. The work of Keith Murray, whose book, The Modocs and Their War, was published in 1959, was particularly important in establishing the historical record with care and without the most obvious forms of prejudice. The work of Richard Dillon and Jeff Riddle, who was the son of Toby and Frank Riddle, and who wrote his own account of the war, added perspectives and details that the official military records did not contain. More recent scholarship has continued to deepen and complicate our understanding of the conflict, drawing on oral traditions preserved within the Modoc communities and on archival sources that were not fully explored in earlier work. What all of these accounts share, whatever their differences of interpretation and emphasis, is the recognition that the Modoc War was not a simple story. It was not a story of pure victims and pure villains, though it had injustices in it so clear and so large that they cannot be minimized without dishonesty. It was a story of people trapped by circumstances not of their making choices under impossible pressure, some of those choices wise and some of them not, and all of them insufficient against the scale of what was being brought to bear on a small community in a volcanic landscape at the edge of the world they knew. Captain Jack was not a perfect man, and the story of the Modoc War is not a perfect story. The killing of the peace commissioners was wrong, and Captain Jack knew it was wrong and did it anyway, because the forces bearing down on him from every direction had narrowed the space in which any choice at all was possible down to something almost too small to see. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and it is one that the historical record supports fully. He was a man in an impossible position, who made an impossible choice and paid for it with his life, while the men who had pushed him toward that choice lived on and were rewarded for their cooperation with something closer to mercy. Hooker Jim, who killed the settlers on the east shore of Tule Lake, who pressured Captain Jack into the killing of the peace commissioners, who then led the army to Captain Jack's hiding place, was not executed. He was not imprisoned. He was resettled, along with the other Modoc who had surrendered and cooperated on the Kintpuash reservation in Oklahoma. He lived until around 1880, dying of natural causes in exile but alive, which was more than Captain Jack had. There is something in that disparity that the historical record does not try very hard to explain, because the historical record, as it was constructed, was not very interested in the justice of the individual outcomes. The war was over. The Modoc were removed. The lava beds were quiet. The land was available. That was what mattered in 1873, and the moral accounting that the situation required was left to later generations who had, by then, the luxury of looking at it from a distance. We are among those later generations. We have that luxury, if luxury is even the right word, for the ability to see clearly something that could not be seen clearly by those living inside it. And what we can see from here is a story of a small people who had a deep knowledge of their landscape, who were given an impossible choice between slow erosion on a reservation not suited to their needs and open resistance that they knew they could not ultimately win, and who chose resistance because the alternative was a different kind of death, slower and perhaps less visible but no less real. They held the United States Army at bay for 6 months in the lava beds with 50 warriors. That is a fact of American military history that is almost never taught, that is almost never mentioned in the broad surveys of the Indian Wars that appear in textbooks and popular histories. The Little Bighorn gets its chapters, its monuments, its films and novels, an enduring place in the national mythology. The Modoc stronghold gets footnotes. The disparity in how these two conflicts are remembered says something about what we have chosen to remember and what we have chosen to let recede. The name Kintpuash. It is worth saying again, Kintpuash. Before he was Captain Jack, before he was the leader of a war, before he was a defendant in a military tribunal, before he was executed and decapitated and sent to a museum, he was Kintpuash. He was a man born somewhere around 1837 on the shores of Tule Lake, in a community that had known this landscape for generations. He grew up fishing and hunting and learning the patterns of the volcanic plateau. He went to Eureka and saw the world that was coming toward his people and came home with the knowledge of what it meant. He tried, for years, to find a way to protect his community within the framework of American law and policy, attending to the negotiations and the petitions and the discussions that the system required, and finding, again and again, that the system was not designed to produce the outcome he was seeking. He led his people into the lava beds when the soldiers came, and he defended them there with extraordinary effectiveness. And he was betrayed by the men who had pushed him to his most desperate act. And he was hanged, and his name was reduced to a nickname that someone gave him because of a jacket with brass buttons. That is who he was. That is what happened to him. And the story of the Modoc people does not end with his death. It continues in Oklahoma and in Oregon, in the work of language preservation and cultural recovery and political advocacy that the descendants of those 50 warriors and those 150 women and children and elders are doing today. It continues in the lava beds, which are still there, still the same impossible terrain, still preserving in their twisted rock the evidence of a defense that should not have been possible and was. The tule reeds still grow at the edges of what remains of Tule Lake. The moon rises over the rim rock on winter nights and casts its light across the lava fields, and the landscape is as quiet as it ever was in the long centuries before the wagon wheels and the army boots and the sound of cannon fire disturbed it. The volcanic plateau does not remember anything in the way that people remember things. It simply is, persistent and indifferent, holding in its geology the record of forces so much larger than the brief and human drama that played out across its surface in the years around 1873. But we can remember, we can hold the story of the Modoc in the same attention we give to the larger and more celebrated stories of American history that can refuse to let it recede into the footnotes where it has spent too long already. We can say the name Kintpuash. We can think about what it means that 50 warriors held an army at bay for 6 months in a landscape they knew and loved, and what it means that those warriors are not celebrated in the same breath as other defenders of impossible positions, and why those questions matter for what we think we know about who we are and how we got here. The lava beds are quiet tonight, somewhere under an enormous sky that belongs equally to the past and the present. The rock is cold, and the stars are very bright, and the landscape that the Modoc knew as home is still, in the most fundamental geological sense, itself. The wars that moved across it have faded into documentation and memory, and the slow accumulation of scholarship that tries to make sense of what happened here. The people whose blood soaked into the volcanic soil are gone in the physical sense, but their descendants are here, continuing the long work of being Modoc in a world that has never made that easy. Rest now. The story is told for tonight, or enough of it, the parts that can be held in a single long telling. There are more details in every corner of it, more names and dates and documents and testimonies, more threads that run off in every direction into the larger history of the American West and the native peoples who lived through that history and beyond it. But what we have covered tonight is the shape of it, the arc from the volcanic lakeshore where Kintpuash was born, through the lava beds where he fought to the gallows at Fort Klamath where he died, and then forward into the long aftermath, the exile and the survival and the memory that carries the story forward into the present. Let your breathing slow. Let the story settle into whatever part of you receives stories at this hour. The quiet part, the part that does not require understanding before it can hold something. The Modoc were here. They fought for their home. They lost, in the way that the word losing applies when one side has 100 men and the other has an army. But they did not vanish, and they did not stop being who they were, and the landscape that was theirs still exists, still holds in its volcanic rock the record of their defense, still offers itself to the sky and the weather and the occasional visitor who comes to walk the stronghold and to try to imagine what it was like to stand in that twisted terrain with 50 warriors and hold the line. The night is deep now, wherever you are. The sound of the world outside has grown very distant. There is nothing that needs your attention in this moment. There is only the slow movement of breath and the quiet that gathers around a story when the story has been told. The lava beds are quiet. The stars are out over the volcanic plateau, and somewhere in the long memory of this continent, in the place where the stories that have not been told enough are waiting for the telling, the name Kintpuash is written down. Captain Jack, the man with the brass button jacket, the last leader of the free Modoc, the man who fought for 6 months in the lava beds and lost and was right about everything that mattered and paid for it anyway. Sleep well. The story will still be here when morning comes. There are things about this story that cannot be fully understood without going more slowly through the world that produced it. without spending more time in the landscape and the culture of the Modoc before the soldiers arrived, before the treaties were signed, before the long catastrophe of the 1870s began to unfold. So let us go back. Let us go back much further than 1872, back before the Applegate Trail, back before the first American surveyor turned his instruments toward the volcanic plateau of Northern California, back into the long, quiet centuries when the Modoc world was intact and the lava beds were simply home. The world of the Modoc before sustained contact with outsiders was not a static world. This bears saying, because one of the persistent misconceptions about Native American cultures is that they existed in a kind of timeless suspension before Europeans arrived, unchanging and unchangeable, defined by practices and beliefs that had never shifted. This is not accurate for any people, and it is particularly not accurate for the people of the interior Pacific Northwest, who lived in a region that was itself dynamic, where the landscape was shaped by ongoing geological processes, where the climate varied enough between decades to affect the available resources significantly, where the populations of neighboring peoples changed and their relationships with one another shifted in response. The Modoc had undergone significant changes even in the centuries immediately before contact. Their population had fluctuated with the cycles of abundance and scarcity that the volcanic plateau produced. Their political structures had evolved as the groups within the broader Modoc community had grown and contracted and merged and separated in response to the circumstances of their environment. The relationships between the Modoc and the Klamath, their closest cultural relatives, had gone through periods of alliance and periods of conflict and periods of something in between. The complicated coexistence of peoples who are similar enough to understand each other and different enough to disagree about important things. The Klamath people, who lived primarily to the north of the Modoc in the basin of what is now Klamath Lake, shared with the Modoc not only a broadly similar language, but a broadly similar way of life. Both peoples were organized around the wetland economies of their respective lake basins. Both were fishing people. Both built pit houses for winter habitation and used tule mat structures for the warmer seasons. Both participated in the same broad trade networks and the same patterns of seasonal movement through their territories. But the Modoc and the Klamath were not one people. They had separate identities, separate leadership structures, and a long history of sometimes difficult relations that made the prospect of sharing a reservation something considerably more fraught than the treaty negotiators in 1864 appear to have fully appreciated. To the south and west of the Modoc were the peoples of what is now Northern California, groups whose names and territories and histories are less well documented in the scholarly literature, but who were real and present and important in the world that the Modoc inhabited. The Achumawi, sometimes called the Pit River people, after the river that ran through their territory, were one of the groups that the Modoc had complex relationships with, relationships that included trade and sometimes conflict, and the kind of mutual awareness that neighbors develop when they have lived next to each other for a long time. The Atsugewi, another Pit River people, lived to the south of the Achumawi, and likewise had their own long-standing connections with the Modoc country. These relationships were part of the web of social and political life in the interior that the Modoc navigated every season, and understanding them helps to understand why the idea of a small, isolated band of warriors defending a stronghold in the lava beds was not quite as isolated as it might appear from the outside. The Modoc were embedded in a network of relationships that extended in every direction from the lava beds, and those relationships shaped what was possible and what was not during the months of the war. The spiritual life of the Modoc is another dimension of this story that deserves more careful attention than it usually receives. The Modoc, like many peoples of the interior Pacific Northwest, practiced a form of shamanism in which individuals with particular spiritual gifts, trained through rigorous and sometimes painful processes of initiation and development, served as mediators between the human community and the spiritual forces that the Modoc understood to be present in the landscape and in the living world. These shamans, called Indian doctors in many of the English language sources, performed healing ceremonies for the sick, conducted rituals to ensure the success of hunting and fishing, and played a role in the political and social life of the community that was significant and that coexisted in complex ways with the secular authority of the chiefs. Curly-headed Doctor, whose importance in the Modoc War has already been mentioned, was a shaman of unusual power and confidence, a man who believed deeply in his ability to invoke protective forces on behalf of his people, and who used that belief to sustain the morale of the Modoc warriors through the long months of the siege. The red rope he stretched around the perimeter of the stronghold, the ceremonies he conducted, the assurances he gave that soldiers who crossed the rope would fall dead, all of this was part of a coherent spiritual practice that was not simply superstition in the dismissive sense that the army officers who wrote about it sometimes implied. It was a system of belief with its own internal logic, a way of understanding and engaging with the forces that governed the outcome of dangerous situations. Whether the rope and the ceremonies provided the warriors with the psychological confidence to fight as effectively as they did is impossible to quantify, but the possibility is real. Belief matters in combat. The conviction that one is protected, that the forces of the universe are aligned with one's cause, is not nothing. It may be everything in the moments when the shooting starts. When the army's first assault failed so completely in January of 1873, when 50 Modoc warriors turned back hundreds of soldiers without taking a single casualty of their own confirmed in the record, Curly-headed Doctor's authority and his assurances were dramatically confirmed in the eyes of the warriors who had fought under his spiritual protection. The rope had held, the ceremonies had worked. This created a problem for Captain Jack, because it strengthened the hand of those who believed that military resistance could succeed indefinitely, that the spiritual protection available to the Modoc made the army's material superiority irrelevant. Captain Jack knew better. Captain Jack had been to Eureka. He had seen the world beyond the lava beds. He knew that the army would not stop, that the political will in Washington to prosecute this war was effectively unlimited, that no amount of tactical brilliance in the stronghold could alter the fundamental arithmetic of the situation. But after January's assault, making that argument within the community of fighters who had just achieved a stunning military success was very difficult. The peace negotiations that began in February and March of 1873 were conducted against this background, against the tension between Captain Jack's political realism and the military confidence of the warriors who believed they could hold the stronghold indefinitely. Alfred Meacham, when he entered this situation, was not simply a representative of the government trying to end a war. He was trying to find a path between two groups, each of which was under intense internal pressure, each of which had positions that were fundamentally incompatible, and each of which was being pulled in different directions by voices within their own communities. It was, in some respects, a situation that was impossible to resolve through negotiation alone, because the things that were being negotiated were not simply policy questions, but questions of survival and identity, and the meaning of the choices already made. Meacham's reports from this period, and the reports of other observers who were present near the lava beds during the negotiations, give us a picture of a negotiating process that was conducted under extraordinary difficulty. Messages went back and forth through intermediaries. The Riddles, Toby and Frank, crossed between the two camps repeatedly, carrying words and returning with responses, navigating the danger of their position with a skill and a courage that is not always adequately recognized in accounts that focus on the principal figures. Toby Riddle, in particular, who was Modoc herself, was in an almost impossibly difficult position. She understood what was being said in the Modoc camp. She understood the planning that was underway for the killing of the commissioners. She tried to warn the commissioners, and they did not fully believe her, or they believed her but concluded that the consequences of not going to the meeting were worse than the risk of going. It is one of the genuine tragedies of the Modoc War, among several genuine tragedies, that her warnings were not heeded more seriously. The months between January and April of 1873 were months of extraordinary tension in both camps. The army was reinforcing and resupplying and planning its next moves. The Modoc in the stronghold were holding together as well as they could, maintaining their community in conditions of siege that were physically demanding and emotionally exhausting. Food supplies were a constant concern. The women in the stronghold were doing the work of keeping the community fed and the children cared for, and the wounded tended under conditions that gave them almost no room for anything beyond those immediate tasks. The men were maintaining the defenses and watching the perimeter and attending the councils where the decisions about what to do next were being argued through with increasing desperation. It was not a comfortable life. It was a life lived at the absolute edge of what was sustainable, held together by the bonds of community and the common understanding that the alternatives were worse. The geology of the stronghold itself deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it was the geology that made everything possible. The section of the lava beds where the Modoc established their primary defensive position was the product of a particular kind of volcanic activity, the slow outpouring of basaltic lava from fissures in the Earth's surface that, as it cooled, contracted and cracked and formed the complex topography of tubes and ridges and trenches that the Modoc used so effectively. Lava tubes, which are formed when the outer surface of a lava flow cools and hardens, while the molten rock inside continues to drain away, leaving a hollow channel, are common throughout the lava beds. Some of them are quite extensive, running for hundreds of feet underground. Others are shorter, but even the shorter ones provided concealed movement corridors that were invaluable in the defensive fighting of the war. The natural trenches that ran through the stronghold area were not simply depressions in the surface. Many of them were deep enough to stand in without exposure, to move along without being visible above the surrounding rock, to use as firing positions, from which a warrior could engage targets at considerable range, while presenting virtually no target himself. An attacking soldier crossing the open ground toward the stronghold would be crossing that ground under observation and under fire while being unable to see the shooter, unable to fix the position from which the fire was coming, because the shooter would move along the trench between shots, unable to bring effective fire to bear on something that could not be seen. It was the tactical situation that every defender dreams of and almost none achieve. The Modoc had not built this position. The volcano had built it for them over thousands of years, and they had recognized its value and made it their own. Water was the great vulnerability of the stronghold. The lava beds had no reliable internal source of fresh water. The Modoc carried water from Tule Lake, which was not far, but was in a direction that required exposure to army observation. As the siege continued, maintaining the water supply became increasingly difficult. The army understood this and attempted to interdict the water runs, with varying success. The Modoc managed the problem with the ingenuity that long familiarity with the landscape made possible, finding caches and alternate routes that the army did not know about, working the water problem on a day-by-day basis. With the practical creativity of people who understood every option the terrain offered. The horses were another logistical challenge. The Modoc had horses, and those horses needed to be fed and watered in conditions that were difficult for people and far more difficult for animals. Some of the horses were lost during the siege to the army's fire and to the difficulties of maintaining them in the confined space of the stronghold. Others were butchered for food, as the food situation deteriorated in the later months of the siege. The loss of the horses was felt keenly, not only as a practical matter but as an emotional one, because the Modoc had invested considerable effort in building their horse herds in the years before the war, and the horses represented something beyond simple utility. The children in the stronghold are not often written about, and yet they were there. They were present throughout the months of the siege. They experienced every aspect of what the adults experienced, with the particular vulnerability of childhood. They heard the gunfire. They felt the cold. They ate the diminishing rations. They watched their parents and older relatives make decisions under pressure that they could not fully understand. They were Modoc children who had grown up in the lava bed country, who knew this landscape in the way that children know the places where they live, through the body and the senses and the accumulated experience of years of movement through a specific terrain. What the siege was doing to their understanding of that landscape, transforming it from home to fortress, from the world they knew into the world where the fighting happened, is something that the documentary record does not address directly, but that imagination can reach toward. The elders in the stronghold present another dimension. The old men and women who had lived their full lives in the lava bed country, who had seen the first wagon trains on the Applegate Trail, who remembered the world before the California gold rush brought the first flood of outsiders through the country, were in the stronghold along with everyone else, carrying in their memories the full depth of Modoc experience and the full weight of what was being lost. They were the repositories of the language and the stories and the practical knowledge of the landscape. Their survival was not simply the survival of individual people, but the survival of something irreplaceable, the accumulated knowing of generations. Let us spend some time with the landscape in a different way, not as a tactical question, but as a living world. The world that the Modoc had inhabited for so long and that they were fighting for in the winter and spring of 1873. Tule Lake, before the draining projects of the early 20th century, was one of the most significant wetland ecosystems in the western interior. It was vast, shallow, and extraordinarily productive. During the migration seasons, it was visited by waterfowl in numbers that contemporary accounts describe in terms that modern readers might find difficult to credit if they did not know that the Pacific Flyway, the great north-south corridor of bird migration along the western edge of the continent, passed directly over this region. Hundreds of thousands of birds, perhaps millions in the peak periods, stopped on Tule Lake and the surrounding marshes in the spring and fall. The Canadas, the snow geese, the pintails and teals and widgeons and redheads and canvasbacks, the grebes and pelicans and herons that use the lake year-round. All of this wildlife was embedded in the Modoc understanding of the world and in the Modoc economy, not simply as resource to be extracted, but as part of the community of life in which the Modoc understood themselves to participate. The fish runs in Tule Lake and in the Lost River were similarly extraordinary by the standards of what we now regard as normal for interior wetland systems. The Lost River suckers that came up in their spring runs were taken in large numbers and dried for winter use. The tule perch that lived in the shallows of the lake year-round provided protein across the seasons. The crayfish and the freshwater mussels that lived in the lake and its tributaries were additional food sources that the Modoc knew how to exploit. The cattails and the tule reeds were not only material resources, but food resources as well, with the young shoots providing a spring vegetable that was an important addition to the diet in the hungry weeks before the main fish runs began. The camas bulbs and the wapato and the other tubers that grew in the margins of the lake and in the meadows around it added carbohydrates to the diet in ways that made the overall nutrition of the Modoc in good years quite adequate by the standards of any pre-industrial people anywhere in the world. This was what the Treaty of 1864 had taken, not simply a piece of ground, but an entire ecological economy, a system of production and knowledge and relationship between people and landscape that had been refined over generations to the point where it worked, where it provided what the community needed across the range of seasonal variation that the plateau experienced. The reservation offered in exchange was not an equivalent. The Klamath Reservation in the Upper Klamath Basin had its own productive landscapes, its own fish runs and wetland resources, but they were not the Modoc's resources. They were organized by the logic of Klamath territory and Klamath knowledge, and arriving on the Klamath Reservation as a newcomer, with insufficient supplies from the government to bridge the gap while the new landscape was being learned, was arriving in scarcity in ways that the lava bed country had not been scarce. The historical record on the conditions at the Klamath Reservation during the years the Modoc were there, from 1864 to 1870, is fragmentary and somewhat contradictory. The Indian agents who administered the reservation during this period produced reports that varied considerably in their assessments of conditions, partly because different agents had different standards of what adequate conditions looked like, and partly because the conditions themselves varied year to year. What is consistent across the reports is that the supplies promised in the treaty were frequently inadequate in quantity and often late in delivery. What is also consistent is that the tension between the Modoc and the Klamath groups on the reservation was real and was not effectively managed by the agency staff. The Modoc were a minority within the reservation's political structure, and the Klamath, as the majority group, and the home people, had advantages that the agency structure tended to reinforce rather than balance. Captain Jack's departure for Lost River in 1870 was not impulsive. It was the conclusion of 6 years of trying to make the reservation work, of petitioning the agent for better supplies and better mediation of the conflicts with the Klamath, of watching his community deteriorate in conditions that he had not agreed to and that he could see were not improving. When he went south, he was acting on an assessment that was accurate and a judgment that was, given the constraints he faced, reasonable. The question of whether it was wise in a longer strategic sense is a different question, and one that hindsight makes easier to answer. In the moment, with the information available to him in 1870, Captain Jack's decision to return to Lost River looks like the decision of a man who understood his situation clearly and was choosing the option that seemed most likely to preserve his community, even knowing that it would create a confrontation with the government. The years between 1870 and 1872, the years Captain Jack's band spent on Lost River before the soldiers came, are years that the historical record treats relatively briefly, because they were years without dramatic incident, without the kind of events that generate documentation and therefore survive in the archives. But they were not uneventful years. They were years during which the Modoc community maintained itself in its traditional landscape, doing the things it knew how to do, fishing and hunting and gathering and trading, and maintaining its relationships with the surrounding settler community, which was itself growing and changing as more families moved into the Lost River Valley and the surrounding region in pursuit of the agricultural life that the government's land policies were making available to them. The relationship between Captain Jack's band and the settlers in the Lost River Valley during these years was not uniformly hostile. Some settlers had known the Modoc for years, since before the treaty, and maintained working relationships with them that involved trade and occasional employment, and the kind of pragmatic coexistence that develops when people share a landscape for long enough to learn each other's habits. Others were newer arrivals, with no prior relationship with the Modoc, and with the anxieties that were common among settler communities in the period, anxieties that were partly based in real incidents that had occurred in the broader region, and partly based in the general atmosphere of fear and hostility toward native peoples that the newspapers and the political culture of the period sustained and amplified. The settler petitions to the Indian Bureau that appear in the documentary record during the years between 1870 and 1872 reflect both kinds of settlers, those who were genuinely frightened and those who were using the language of fear to advance land interests that would benefit from the removal of the Modoc from the area. The Indian Bureau in Washington received these petitions and deliberated and corresponded and forwarded documents to the military and received documents back from the military and deliberated some more, and the months passed. Captain Jack, for his part, was not simply waiting passively during this period. He was continuing to press his case for a small reservation on Lost River through whatever channels were available to him, meeting with officials who came south to assess the situation, writing through intermediaries to the Indian Bureau, maintaining communications with the Eureka newspapers that had covered Modoc affairs for years, and that provided him with a kind of public platform that he understood and used with some sophistication. He was, in other words, working the political system as best he could from his position within it, while also preparing, as any prudent leader would, for the possibility that the political system would not produce the outcome he was seeking. There is something in that dual preparation, the political work and the practical preparation for conflict, that is very human and very recognizable. Captain Jack was not a man who wanted war. The documentary record, including the accounts of people who knew him and spoke with him during the years before the fighting, consistently describes someone who was calculating the risks and costs of every option with great care, who was not driven by the kind of anger that leads to reckless action, who was trying to find the path through an impossible situation that ended with his people intact and alive. The path he found, or was pushed onto, was not that path, but the trying was real. When the soldiers arrived at dawn on the 29th of November, 1872, they interrupted a morning that had been ordinary in every way. The morning had been ordinary for years. People were waking, fires were being lit for the morning meal. The community was beginning its day in the rhythms that had characterized its life on Lost River since 1870. Into this ordinary morning, Captain James Jackson and his detachment arrived with orders that were, in their implementation, deeply flawed. Jackson was a competent officer in many respects, but the plan for disarming the Modoc, which was what he had been tasked with as a preliminary step to compelling their return to the reservation, was not well conceived. The demand that the Modoc surrender their weapons was made without adequate understanding of what that demand meant to people in Captain Jack's position, without sufficient attention to the dynamics of a community that was being asked to do something that amounted to rendering itself defenseless, without the kind of preparation and patience that a successful disarmament operation requires. The exact sequence of events in the moments before the shooting started is disputed, as I mentioned earlier. The underlying dynamic that produced those events, the combination of fear and pride, and the practical reality that armed men on both sides were very close to each other in a situation of high tension, is not disputed. The shooting was, in some sense, the inevitable outcome of the collision between the Army's orders and the Modoc's situation. What made the outcome of that morning so consequential was not only the gunfire at Captain Jack's camp, but the killings that Hooker Jim and his warriors committed as they fled along the eastern shore of Tule Lake. Those killings, of settlers who had no direct role in the morning's confrontation, transformed the situation from a failed disarmament operation into a multiple homicide case in the eyes of both the law and the public. They took what might have been resolvable, a confrontation between soldiers and a Modoc band that had left a reservation, and made it something that required a different and more violent response. They also, almost certainly, were not a strategically calculated act. They were the act of men fleeing in fear and anger, men who had just been fired on and who were moving as fast as they could away from the source of the fire, men who encountered settlers in their path and killed them in the chaos and terror of that morning. This does not make the killings any less real or any less tragic for the families of those who died. It does help explain why they happened in a way that is more coherent than simple savagery, which is how the newspapers mostly described them. Hooker Jim's killings, on the morning of November 29, also explain something about his later actions, specifically his decision to surrender and cooperate with the Army in leading soldiers to Captain Jack. When it became clear that the stronghold could not be held indefinitely, when the internal cohesion of the Modoc fighting force was fracturing under the accumulated pressure of months of siege, Hooker Jim faced a choice that was in some respects even starker than the choices Captain Jack faced. He had killed settlers. He had killed them on American soil, under American jurisdiction, in circumstances that American law would classify as murder, regardless of the broader context of the conflict. He was looking, in the event of capture, not simply at imprisonment on the reservation or removal to Indian territory, but at the hangman. His decision to guide the Army to Captain Jack's location was not loyalty to the Americans. It was an attempt to bargain his own life and the lives of the men who followed him with the one thing he had to trade: information about where Captain Jack was hiding. The morality of that bargain is something that has been debated within Modoc communities ever since. Hooker Jim is not remembered well in the Modoc oral tradition as far as the scholarly literature indicates. He is the man who pushed Captain Jack toward an act that Captain Jack opposed, and then, when the consequences of that act arrived, surrendered and traded Captain Jack's life for his own. Within any community's moral understanding, this is a particular kind of betrayal, and its weight has not diminished with time. But let us not leave Hooker Jim as simply a villain, because the Modoc story is not well served by simple villains any more than it is well served by simple heroes. Hooker Jim was a man who had also been dispossessed. He had also watched his community lose the landscape it depended on and struggle on a reservation that did not work. He had also experienced the fear and the anger of that November morning and had killed in the grip of those emotions. The choices available to him in the spring of 1873 were terrible in every direction, and the choice he made was the one that kept him alive. That it was made at another man's expense, that it was made by someone who had put that other man in the position he was in, is the dark irony at the heart of the final act of the Modoc War, and it is an irony that the historical record does not resolve, and probably cannot. The trial at Fort Klamath in July of 1873 was, by any modern standard of legal procedure, inadequate. The military tribunal that conducted it was composed of army officers who had been part of the war itself, who had colleagues among the dead, who were not in any meaningful sense neutral arbiters of the facts and the law. The defendants were not given adequate time to consult with anyone who might have helped them understand the proceedings. The translation of the charges and the testimony was imperfect. The concept of legal defense, of an advocate whose job was to challenge the prosecution's case on behalf of the defendant, was present in form but not in substance. The trial lasted a few days. The outcome was, as I said, not seriously in doubt from the beginning. What makes the trial at Fort Klamath particularly important, beyond its immediate outcomes, is what it reveals about the legal status of the Modoc as the government understood it. The choice to try Captain Jack and the others by military tribunal rather than in a civil court was not simply a procedural preference. It reflected a specific legal theory, one that the government's lawyers had to construct in order to justify the tribunal at all, a theory that held that the Modoc were subject to American law as individuals, while simultaneously not recognized as a nation engaged in a legitimate war. This was a legal position that was, to put it mildly, in tension with the practice of the preceding decades, during which the United States government had been negotiating treaties with the Modoc and other native peoples, as if they were nations with sovereignty over their territories, and the ability to cede that sovereignty through treaty. The Council Grove Treaty of 1864 was premised on that recognition. If the Modoc were not a nation capable of entering into binding agreements, the treaty was a legal nullity. If they were a nation, then Captain Jack and the others were prisoners of war, not criminals. The government could not have it both ways, though it tried. This legal contradiction was not unique to the Modoc case. It was embedded in the entire structure of American Indian law, as it had developed by 1873, and the Modoc case illuminated it with unusual clarity, precisely because the situation was so stark. Captain Jack had led a military resistance. He had been captured in the field. He was being tried for acts committed during that resistance. The argument that he was not a prisoner of war but a murderer required ignoring the military character of the entire conflict, the Army's own designation of the situation as a war, the military chain of command under which the operations against the Modoc were conducted, and the military commission that was now sitting in judgment. The argument was self-contradictory, and everyone involved knew it, or should have. The execution, on the 3rd of October, 1873, was attended by large numbers of people, as executions of this kind typically were. It was also observed and reported by journalists who had covered the war and who now covered its final act with the same attention. The accounts that survive describe the 4 condemned men as composed on the scaffold, as meeting their deaths without the visible fear that observers perhaps expected or hoped to see. Captain Jack is described in some accounts as having made a statement, as having said something about the injustice of what was being done, though the exact words are not consistent across sources, and the reliability of any specific quotation is difficult to establish at this distance. What is consistent across the accounts is the broader context of the crowd and the occasion. Modoc people were brought to witness the execution, as I mentioned earlier, as a deliberate demonstration. The intent was pedagogical, in the most brutal sense. The government and the army wanted the surviving Modoc to understand, viscerally and personally, what the consequences of resistance were. Whether the surviving Modoc drew the lesson the government intended from what they saw that morning is another question. The lesson that most human communities draw from watching their leaders executed is not necessarily the lesson of docile submission. It is sometimes, instead, the lesson of what was lost and why it was lost, and what must be preserved in memory so that the loss does not become total. The removal to Oklahoma began almost immediately after the executions. The surviving Modoc, approximately 150 people, were gathered and transported east in a process that the historical record describes in terse administrative terms, but that was, for the people who experienced it, a journey away from everything they had known. They traveled by wagon, initially, across the volcanic plateau, and then south and east, through landscapes that grew progressively less familiar. They crossed the Sierra Nevada and descended into the Central Valley of California, terrain that was nothing like the lava beds. They traveled across the deserts of the interior West, through landscapes that the volcanic plateau had not prepared them for, through heat and dust and the disorientation of movement, through unfamiliar country at someone else's pace and under someone else's direction. The journey to the Kintpuash reservation in Indian Territory took weeks. By the time they arrived, the Modoc were physically exhausted and in various states of illness, the consequences of the journey and of the preceding months of conflict, and the emotional and physical toll of displacement. The Kintpuash reservation, in what is now northeastern Oklahoma, was a very different world from northern California. The climate was different, more humid, more prone to the fevers and respiratory illnesses that the Modoc, coming from the dry volcanic plateau, had relatively limited immunity to. The landscape was different, flat and wooded in ways that were the opposite of the open volcanic horizon the Modoc had grown up under. The other peoples on the reservation, the Kintpuash and others who had been settled there, were strangers with different languages, different cultures, different histories. The Modoc in Oklahoma did not disappear into this strangeness. They held together as a community. They maintained their language in the home, even as their children learned English in the government schools that were the primary form of education available to them. They maintained their social bonds, the kinship networks, and the community relationships that had held them together through the war and through the journey. They held ceremonies, carefully and sometimes covertly, maintaining the spiritual practices that connected them to who they were. They died in numbers that reflected the difficulty of their situation, the diseases and the poverty and the grief that exile produced, but they continued. The political work of the Oklahoma Modoc in the decades following the war was sustained and intelligent. They petitioned Washington for the right to return to Oregon. They worked through the Indian agents and through sympathetic politicians and through the network of reform organizations that were active in Indian affairs in the late 19th century. Their case was helped by the sympathy that the Modoc War had generated among Eastern audiences who had read about it with something of the fascination that attaches to extraordinary military events and something of the discomfort that attaches to events whose justice is clearly questionable. Alfred Meacham, who lived until 1882, continued to advocate for the Modoc from the East, speaking and writing and trying to keep the story in public awareness. His efforts, and the efforts of others who cared about the Modoc situation, created the conditions under which the eventual partial return to Oregon was possible. The 1909 permission for some Modoc people to return to the Klamath Reservation was not a return to the homeland. It was a return to the place they had left in 1870 to get back to the homeland, which is a complicated kind of return, a return to exile rather than to home. But it was something. It was the recognition that the permanent exile to Oklahoma was not immutable, that the removal had been a punishment that did not need to be permanent, that the Modoc people had a relationship to the Pacific Northwest that could be acknowledged even within the framework of American Indian policy. The Oklahoma Modoc who did not return stayed. They had built lives over 3 decades, had established themselves in the landscape of northeastern Oklahoma in ways that made relocation another kind of disruption. They had children and grandchildren who had grown up on the Kintpuash reservation and for whom Oklahoma was home, was the place their families were, was the landscape they knew. The decision whether to go or to stay was not simple, and different individuals and families made different choices, and neither choice was wrong. The Oklahoma Modoc tribe today is a federally recognized tribe with its own tribal government, its own programs for language and cultural preservation, its own economic development enterprises. They hold their tribal homecoming ceremony each year in Miami, Oklahoma, which is the town closest to their original reservation land. They maintain the Modoc language program, working with the small number of fluent speakers who remain, and with recordings and documentation created in earlier decades to teach the language to younger generations. The work is difficult, and its success is not guaranteed, but it is being done with the seriousness and the commitment that the situation requires. The Klamath tribes in Oregon, which include the Modoc as one of their constituent groups, alongside the Klamath and the Yahoo skin, have their own complex history with federal policy. In 1954, as part of the federal termination policy that sought to end the government's trust relationship with tribal nations, the Klamath tribes were terminated, stripped of their federal recognition and their reservation land. This was, in many respects, a second dispossession, adding to the long chain of dispossessions that the Modoc story is made of. The termination of the Klamath tribes was deeply harmful to the people it affected, producing poverty and community disruption, and the loss of resources that had sustained the community for generations. In 1986, federal recognition was restored, and the work of rebuilding what had been taken began again, as it has had to begin so many times in the history of these people. The lava beds, meanwhile, became a national monument, and then a site of tourism and outdoor recreation and historical interpretation. Visitors come from around the world to see the volcanic landscape, to walk the caves and the stronghold, to stand in the places where the Modoc War was fought. The National Park Service has, over the decades, developed increasingly careful and balanced interpretive materials about the history of the site, materials that try to convey the Modoc perspective with respect and accuracy. The monument partners with the Klamath tribes in its educational and interpretive programs, acknowledging the continuing connection of the Modoc people to this landscape, even after a century and a half of displacement and change. There is a kind of justice in that acknowledgement, imperfect and insufficient as it is. The acknowledgement that the lava beds belong to Modoc history, that the Modoc story is part of the meaning of this landscape, that the people who fought here deserve to be remembered in terms that go beyond the simple characterization of savage enemy or tragic victim, is a kind of justice that the men and women who lived through the Modoc War did not receive in their lifetimes, and that their descendants deserve. It does not restore what was taken. It does not undo the killings, or the exile, or the execution, or the decapitation, or the museum. It does not bring back Kintpuash, or give him the reservation on Lost River that he spent his life trying to obtain. But it is something. It is the recognition that the story happened, that the people were real, that what was done to them was not simply the inevitable cost of progress, but a series of choices made by people with agency who might have chosen differently. There were moments, scattered through the documentation of this conflict, when different choices seemed possible. Alfred Meacham's recommendation that a small reservation be established for the Modoc on Lost River, if it had been acted on, might have prevented everything that followed. The decision to send soldiers, rather than continued negotiators, to enforce the return to the Klamath reservation, if it had gone differently, if Captain Jackson had approached the disarmament with more patience and better preparation, might have produced a different outcome on the morning of November 29. The response to the initial fighting, if it had been more measured and less determined to achieve a military solution, might have opened space for a negotiated settlement. And the Peace Commission process, if the commissioners had taken Toby Riddle's warnings seriously and postponed the April 11 meeting, might have prevented the killings that made everything else inevitable. None of these different choices were made. The choices that were made by people operating within the constraints of their moment, shaped by the assumptions and the politics and the economic interests of the 1870s, and the outcomes of those choices were what they were. The counterfactual is useful not as a way of indulging in a historical fantasy of how things might have been better, but as a way of resisting the inevitability that historical narrative sometimes imposes on events. The Modoc War was not inevitable. The exile to Oklahoma was not inevitable. The execution of Captain Jack was not inevitable. These were outcomes of choices, and choices can be otherwise. The children who were in the stronghold in the winter of 1873 grew up and had children of their own. Some of them went to Oklahoma. Some of them returned to Oregon. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are alive today, carrying the heritage of the lava beds and the treaty and the war and the exile in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes private, sometimes a matter of formal tribal politics, and sometimes a matter of what is remembered at family gatherings and told to children before they sleep. The story that is told in those private moments around tables and in living rooms in Oklahoma and Oregon, is not the same as the story that appears in history books. It is richer, more particular, more charged with the specific names and relationships and grievances that do not survive in the documentary record, but that are preserved in the living memory of a community that has been through a great deal and has held together. Anyway, the name Modoc comes from the Klamath language, and its meaning has been translated variously as Southerners or people of the South, referring to the geographic position of the Modoc relative to the Klamath. The Modoc's own name for themselves, Maklaks, means simply the people, as the self-designations of indigenous peoples so often do, the simple assertion of humanity and particularity, we are the people. This is what it means to be human in this place. In this landscape, with these relationships and this knowledge, it is a name worth knowing, worth saying. Maklaks, the people of the lava beds, the people of the volcanic plateau, the people of Tule Lake and the Lost River, the people who held an army at bay for 6 months in twisted volcanic rock, and who lost, and who survived, and who are here. Let the darkness around you deepen a little. Let the sounds of wherever you are settle into the background in a way that is comfortable, in a way that tells you there is nothing immediately requiring your attention. The story has taken us a long way tonight. We have traveled across a century and a half and across a continent, from the shores of Tule Lake to the courtroom at Fort Klamath, to the Kintpuash Reservation in Oklahoma and back again. We have spent time in the stronghold and in the Peace Commission's tent and in the political offices in Washington, where decisions were made that changed the lives of people the decision makers would never meet. It is a long story. It is an American story, in the sense that it could only have happened in the specific historical context of the American West in the second half of the 19th century, shaped by the specific policies and assumptions and power structures of that moment. It is also a human story, in the sense that the people in it were fully human, complicated and capable, and sometimes right and sometimes wrong, trying to navigate an impossible situation with the resources available to them. Captain Jack, Hooker Jim, Alfred Meacham, Toby Riddle, Curly-Headed Doctor, Shonchin John, General Canby, Reverend Thomas, the soldiers who stormed the stronghold in January fog, the settlers in the Lost River Valley who watched the Modoc go south in 1870 with varying degrees of unease and sympathy, the children in the stronghold who heard the artillery, the elders who died in Oklahoma, exile with the lava beds in their memories, all of them fully human, all of them caught in something larger than any of them could individually shape, all of them doing what they did for reasons that make sense within the constraints of their particular position, even when those reasons were insufficient to prevent the tragedy that followed. The night is deep around you now. The breathing has slowed, yours and whoever else might be near you. The slow tide of sleep moving in the way that sleep always moves, without announcement, without clear arrival, just the gradual recession of the day's concerns and the expansion of the quiet that is always waiting beneath them. The story is complete enough for tonight. The Modoc are known, at least a little better than they were an hour ago, at least more completely than the footnote they are usually given. The lava beds are in the mind now, the twisted volcanic rock and the enormous sky and the cold that comes down from the Oregon plateau in winter without anything to stop it. Rest. The story holds. The names are spoken. Kintpuash, Maklaks, the people of the lava beds. They were here. They are here still, in the living communities in Oklahoma and Oregon, in the landscape that keeps the record of what they did in its geology, in the long memory of a people who have had too much to remember and who remember it anyway, because that is what people do who know who they are. They remember. And in the remembering, the story goes on. Sleep well, the night is quiet, the lava beds are quiet, and somewhere under the enormous sky of the volcanic plateau, the stars that the Modoc elders read for weather and for direction are still where they have always been, cold and bright and indifferent to time, keeping their watch over the ancient rock that holds the memory of everything that happened here. The story is told. Rest now. But perhaps sleep has not yet come, and the mind is still moving, still following the thread of the story further back and further in, wanting more of the texture of this world before the war, more of the daily life that the documentary record does not preserve, as well as it preserves the dramatic events. That is a natural wanting, and the night is long enough to honor it. So let us go deeper into the world of the Modoc before the soldiers, into the ordinary texture of life in the lava bed country in the years before the treaties and the removal and the war. A morning in Tule Lake country, sometime in the 1850s, before the emigrant tide had fully arrived, and before the army had thought much about this corner of the continent. The sun rises over the Medicine Lake highlands to the southeast, and the first light reaches the lava plateau in long, slanting rays that pick out the texture of the volcanic rock and make the frost on the grass sparkle for a few minutes before the day's warmth begins. The lake is misted, the shallow water sending up low clouds of evaporation in the cold morning air. And from somewhere out in the reeds comes the sound of geese beginning their morning movements, the conversational honking of birds making their first passes over the water. This is the sound that Modoc people woke to for generations, the sound of the lake asserting itself at the beginning of the day. The pit houses of a winter village were warm inside, warmed by the fire in the central hearth and by the insulation of the earth that surrounded and covered them. The entrance was typically through a hole in the roof, with a notched log serving as a ladder, and the morning routine of emerging from the warmth of the house into the cold of the early air was an experience that every Modoc person knew intimately. That was part of the texture of winter mornings in this landscape. The breath visible in the cold, the sight of the lake through the reeds, the sounds of the waking village. The fishing was typically managed by the men, who built and maintained the weirs and conducted the organized drives that could bring in large quantities of suckers during the spring runs. But the processing of the fish, the splitting and the drying and the storage, was work that involved the whole community, and women's work was at the center of it. The dried fish that sustained the community through the winter was produced by women's skill and women's labor, the careful preparation of the fish that made the difference between a batch that would last through the cold months and one that would spoil and be lost. This knowledge was transmitted from mothers to daughters across generations, accumulated and refined through long practice, and it was as important to the community's survival as any knowledge the men possessed. The tulle reed baskets that the Modoc women wove were objects of considerable artistry, and they were also objects of great practical value. The tight weave that made a basket watertight, able to be used for cooking by heating water with hot stones inside, was a technical achievement that required skill and years of practice. The materials had to be gathered at the right time, prepared correctly, worked in the right way to produce the results that were needed. The knowledge of how to do this was a form of expertise, as real and as demanding as any expertise the modern world recognizes, and the women who possessed it were understood within Modoc society to possess something valuable. The children of the Modoc community grew up in a landscape that was their classroom, learning through observation and participation the skills and the knowledge that their adult lives would require. Boys went with their fathers and uncles on hunting expeditions and fishing trips, watching and helping, and gradually taking on more responsibility as their skills developed. Girls worked alongside their mothers and aunts in the processing of food and the weaving and the management of the household, also gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew. This was not simply the reproduction of a static tradition. It was the transmission of a living knowledge that had been adapted and refined over generations to the specific conditions of the volcanic plateau. And the children who received it were also, in small ways, shaping it, asking questions and experimenting and contributing to the ongoing process by which a community maintains its capacity to sustain itself in a specific place. The stories that the elders told in the winter evenings were another form of education, one that carried different but equally essential knowledge. The mythological traditions of the Modoc, like those of other peoples of the interior Pacific Northwest, were rich and complex, full of characters who embodied the forces and relationships of the natural world in ways that made them available for thought and discussion. Coyote, the trickster who appears in the traditions of many Western peoples, was present in Modoc's story, a figure whose cleverness and appetites and frequent failures illustrated the nature of cleverness and appetite and the costs of overreaching. The stories of the Modoc landscape, the stories that explained why the lava beds had the form they had, why the lake was situated where it was, why certain animals behaved in the ways they did, were not only entertainment, they were the frameworks within which the world was understood, the structures of meaning that made the landscape legible, and the behavior of its living things comprehensible. When the missionaries came to this region, in the 1870s and afterward, they understood Modoc's spiritual life primarily as something to be replaced, as a set of errors and superstitions that stood between the Modoc people and the true religious knowledge that Christianity offered. This understanding, common among the missionaries of the period, missed almost everything important about what Modoc's spiritual life actually was, which was a way of understanding and relating to the world that was deeply embedded in the specific landscape of the volcanic plateau and in the specific experience of living there. The ceremonies that maintained the community's relationships with the forces of that landscape, the dances and the songs, and the rituals that marked the turning points of the year and the transitions of individual lives, were not simply religion in the sense that the missionaries understood religion. They were the practices that kept the community in right relationship with the world that sustained it. The Modoc were not unchanged by the contact they had with outside cultures before the reservation period. The horses that had come to the interior west through the Spanish settlements to the south had been in the Modoc world for generations by the time the American settlers began moving through, and they had changed Modoc life in significant ways. Horses made it possible to range more widely in pursuit of game and trade goods. They made the management of larger horse herds possible, and horse wealth became a dimension of Modoc social status that had not existed before horses arrived. The iron tools and the glass beads and the other manufactured goods that came through the trade networks before direct contact with Americans also left their marks on the material culture of the Modoc in the decades before. 1850. The Modoc of 1850 were not identical to the Modoc of 1750. They were people who had incorporated new elements into their way of life, while maintaining the core of their identity, their language, their landscape, their system of relationships and obligations and knowledge. This capacity for incorporation and adaptation was not unique to the Modoc. It characterized most native peoples of the interior West, who had been managing the introduction of new elements into their worlds for as long as they had existed. But it is worth noting because it complicates the image, sometimes promoted in popular culture, of native peoples as essentially static cultures that broke under the impact of contact with a more dynamic civilization. The Modoc were dynamic. They had been changing and adapting for generations. What they could not adapt to, ultimately, was the speed and the scale and the fundamental incompatibility of what the American expansion brought. Not the introduction of new things, but the removal of the possibility of the world that had sustained them. The replacement of the landscape they had organized their lives around, with a different landscape organized around different principles, by people who had the power to impose their preferences regardless of what the Modoc wanted or needed. The summer in the lava bed country was short and intense after the long winter. The plateau came alive in the warm months in ways that made the labor of summer feel almost like celebration. The gathering of camas bulbs in the meadows, where they bloomed blue and dense in the late spring, the harvesting of the seeds of various grasses, the gathering of berries in the areas where they grew, all of this activity feeding into the stores that would sustain the community through the next winter. The work was communal in ways that the winter's relative confinement was not, with families moving across the landscape in the seasonal patterns that had been established through long experience, going where the food was when it was there, returning to the winter villages when the gathering season was over. The relationships between the Modoc bands, the different family groups that constituted the larger Modoc community, were maintained and renewed through the gatherings that the summer's mobility produced. Marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, alliances were confirmed, and the larger community demonstrated its existence to itself in the gatherings of the warm season. The annual communal hunt for antelope, which required a large number of participants to conduct the drives that moved the animals into positions where they could be taken, was one occasion that brought many bands together. The organized fishing operations at particularly productive locations on the streams and lakes of the territory were another. These gatherings were the occasions when the Modoc community existed as a single entity rather than as a collection of family groups, when the shared identity that the rest of the year divided among the banned territories was brought back together and confirmed. Captain Jack was formed in this world. He grew up in it, learned its skills and its knowledge, participated in its summer gatherings and its winter stories, developed the relationships and the reputation that eventually made him a leader. His intelligence, which the historical record makes clear, was considerable, was shaped by the requirements of this world, by the need to read the landscape and the weather and the behavior of animals and the intentions of other people with the accuracy that survival required. When that intelligence was applied to the very different problem of managing the Modoc community's relationship with the American government, it operated with the same basic methods, the same attention to evidence and pattern, the same calculation of risk and opportunity. The problem was that the world of American politics and law was far less legible than the volcanic plateau, far more obscure in its operations, far more subject to forces that could not be read from the available evidence. The Indian agents who managed the Klamath Reservation during the years the Modoc were there were not, for the most part, malicious people. They were, most of them, people who believed genuinely in the mission they were carrying out, who thought that the reservation system and the cultivation of farming and the teaching of English and the promotion of Christianity were genuinely in the interest of the people they were managing. They were operating within the assumptions of their time and culture, assumptions that held that the traditional life of the Modoc was backward and that the American way of life was the only viable future for native peoples. These assumptions were wrong, comprehensively and consequentially wrong, but they were not held by evil people. They were held by people who were embedded in a culture that had produced them and that validated them at every turn. This does not excuse the outcomes those assumptions produced. The suffering that resulted from the reservation policy, from the inadequate supplies and the enforced cultural change and the disruption of the economic systems that had sustained the Modoc for generations, was real suffering. And it had real causes, and those causes were human decisions made by people with agency, who could have decided differently if they had known differently or cared differently. But understanding those decisions as the product of genuine belief rather than simple malice is important for understanding how systems of harm work, how they can be produced by people who do not think of themselves as harmful, how the assumptions a culture holds about the hierarchy of ways of life can produce consequences that no individual within that culture intends or even clearly sees. The reform movement in American Indian policy that produced the peace policy under Grant, and that produced Alfred Meacham's advocacy after the war, and that produced eventually the allotment policy of the 1880s and the Indian boarding school system, and all the other mechanisms by which the federal government attempted to manage the incorporation of native peoples into American society, was a movement of genuine reformers who believed they were doing good. The harm they did was not the harm of people who wanted to harm. It was the harm of people who knew what was good for others and had the power to impose their knowledge, and who did not have the humility or the curiosity to ask the people they were helping what they themselves wanted or needed. The arrogance of benevolence is a particular and damaging kind of arrogance, and its damage is not mitigated by the intentions that produced it. Captain Jack understood, with the practical intelligence that the lava bed country had given him, that the Americans who were coming to help him were not his enemies, in the way that the army soldiers who were coming to fight him were his enemies. But he also understood that they were not his allies in any full sense. They were people who had decided, on his behalf and without his consent, what the proper outcome of his situation was, and who were now trying to manage him toward that outcome, with the tools of persuasion and legal authority rather than with the tools of violence. The outcome they were managing him toward was not the outcome he wanted, and their inability to offer him the one thing he actually wanted, a small reservation on Lost River where his people could live in the landscape they knew, was not a failure of goodwill. It was a failure of the system they represented, a failure of the capacity of that system to produce the right outcome, even when the people operating it were trying to do right. The peace commission that came to the lava beds in the winter and spring of 1000 873, was not a cynical exercise. The people on it were genuinely trying to end the war without further bloodshed, and their efforts involved real courage, the physical courage of going unarmed into a situation they knew was dangerous, and the moral courage of advocating for a settlement that the political environment around them was hostile to. Alfred Meacham's life was saved, by the closest of margins, on the morning of April 11. He spent the rest of his life carrying the wounds of that morning, and carrying the story of the Modoc to audiences that needed to hear it. That is not the biography of a cynical man. It is the biography of someone who believed something and paid a significant price for believing it, and went on believing it anyway. Toby Riddle's life after the war is another thread worth following for a moment. She had served as the essential interpreter in the negotiations, the person through whom the two sides could even attempt to communicate. She had been present at the killing on April 11, had survived it, had in many accounts been instrumental in saving Alfred Meacham's life. She was a Modoc woman who had married a white settler who occupied the impossible middle position between two worlds in open conflict, who tried to prevent the violence and failed, who tried to save the life of a man being killed and succeeded. She accompanied Meacham on his Eastern lecture tour, standing on stages in cities she had never imagined, speaking to audiences whose world was utterly unlike the volcanic plateau of her childhood, trying to tell the story of her people in a form and a context that these distant audiences could receive. What those audiences received and what they did with it was mixed and imperfect in the way that such receptions always are. The sympathy they felt for the Modoc story was real, but it was also the comfortable sympathy of people at a safe distance from the events, sympathy that did not require them to change anything about their own lives or the policies that had produced the situation in the first place. The lectures were attended, the book was read, the story circulated, and the Modoc remained in exile in Oklahoma. The relationship between sympathy and justice is not automatic, and the history of American Indian advocacy is full of cases where genuine public sympathy for the circumstances of specific native peoples did not translate into the policy changes that might have made a material difference. The bones of Captain Jack and Shonchin John, the heads that were sent to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, stayed in Washington for a very long time. The institution they went to, which eventually became part of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, kept extensive collections of Native American human remains, gathered through the pseudo-scientific practices of the 19th century, practices that were enabled by the military's presence in Indian country and by the legal and moral vacuum in which Native peoples lived during this period. The practice of collecting Native American skulls for scientific study was widespread in the military and civilian scientific communities of the 1800s, and it was made possible by the absence of any legal framework that extended to Native remains the same protections that the remains of people of European descent routinely received. The return of Native American remains from museum collections was not seriously addressed in American law until the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, more than a century after the killings at Fort Klamath, and more than a century after the heads of Captain Jack and Shonchin John were placed in a museum. The repatriation of Modoc remains, including those specific remains, was a process that unfolded in the years following the passage of that law, and it brought the story full circle in a way that is both satisfying and deeply insufficient. The return of remains is important, is right, is necessary. It is also an acknowledgement of how long the wrong had gone on, and of how many generations had to pass before even this limited form of repair was possible. The question of what repair looks like, what it means to address historical injustice across the kind of timescale that separates 1873 from the present, is one of the genuinely difficult questions of American public life, and the Modoc story is one of the places where it comes into particularly sharp focus. There was a war, land was taken, people were killed and exiled. The community was fractured and diminished. The language was nearly lost. The landscape was transformed. All of this happened, and the documentary record is clear about how and why and by whose decisions. What follows from that clarity is contested. The lava beds are a national monument, and visiting them today involves something that did not exist in 1873, the formal acknowledgement on interpretive signs and in the programs of the National Park Service that the Modoc people have a deep and continuing relationship to this landscape, that the history of the war is complex, that the Modoc's cause had justice in it. This acknowledgement is not nothing. It is the result of decades of advocacy and scholarship and changing public consciousness about the history of the American West, and it represents something genuinely different from the silence or the celebratory nationalism that earlier generations of park interpretation offered. But the land is still a federal monument, not Modoc land. The Lost River Valley is still farmland, drained from the shallow lake that the Modoc fished for generations. Tule Lake, much reduced from its 19th century extent, is still partly a federal wildlife refuge and partly private agricultural land. The Klamath Basin water crisis of the early 21st century, in which the competing water needs of agriculture, federal wildlife refuges, and tribal fishing rights have been in continuous and difficult conflict, is the direct descendant of the land and water policies that dispossessed the Modoc and Klamath peoples in the 19th century. The crisis has not been resolved. It continues to unfold, generation by generation, in the landscape that Captain Jack's people knew and fought for and lost. The suckers are still in the water. The Lost River sucker and the short-nosed sucker, both of which were critical food resources for the Modoc people and the Klamath people before them, are both listed as endangered species, reduced by a century of habitat degradation and changed water flows from the abundant populations that the Modoc weirs once harvested. The fish that sustained the Modoc economy for generations are now creatures at the edge of extinction, maintained by federal listings and recovery programs in the landscape that the drainage and irrigation projects have transformed from wetland to farmland. The connection between the dispossession of the Modoc and the degradation of the ecosystem they knew is direct and traceable, one loss producing and enabling the other, the removal of the people who had managed this landscape for generations, opening the way for the management practices that have diminished it. This is one of the things that the Modoc story tells us that is not only about the past, but about the present. The knowledge that the Modoc had of their landscape, the practical ecological knowledge that told them when to fish and where and how much, that told them which springs were reliable and which were not, that told them how the birds moved through the country in different seasons, and what that movement indicated about the condition of the ecosystem. That knowledge was not preserved when the Modoc were removed. It left with them, and what replaced it was the agricultural and extractive knowledge of settlers and federal agencies, knowledge that was applied to the landscape with results that are now, a century and a half later, requiring very expensive and complicated remediation efforts. The ecological services that the Modoc provided, simply by living as they did in the way they did in the landscape they knew, were invisible to the government and settlers of the 1870s. They are not invisible now. The Klamath tribes have been at the center of the water negotiations in the Klamath Basin for decades, bringing to that table the tribal knowledge of the river system and the lake system and the species within them that the federal and state agencies do not possess in the same form or with the same depth. Their participation in these negotiations is an acknowledgement that the knowledge held by indigenous peoples about the landscapes they inhabited is valuable, practically valuable, in ways that the 19th century did not recognize, and that the 21st century is slowly and imperfectly beginning to understand. The road from the forced removal of the Modoc in 1873 to the tribal participation in the Klamath Basin water negotiations of the 21st century is long and winding and full of further dispossessions along the way. But there is a road, and the direction of travel has, at least in some respects, changed. The night is very deep now. The story has gone as far as it goes for tonight, out from the lava beds and back in, through the war and the trial and the execution and the exile and the return and the present, through the landscape and the fish and the water, and the continuing negotiations over the future of a basin that the Modoc knew long before any of the current contestants arrived. The telling is complete, or as complete as any single long night can make it. The rest is in the books and in the archives, and in the living memory of the communities in Oklahoma and Oregon, who carry this story forward in ways that no outside account can fully reach. What remains, in the quiet of this hour, is the simple fact of a people who were here, who made their lives in a volcanic landscape of extraordinary difficulty and beauty, who built their knowledge and their community and their way of being human in a specific place over many generations, who were then required, by the power of a government that had decided their land was needed for other purposes, to give up that landscape and the life they had built within it, who resisted brilliantly and desperately in the lava beds that were their home, who lost, as the mathematics of the situation made inevitable, and who survived, who are surviving still. The stars are out over the volcanic plateau tonight, the same stars that the Modoc elders read for direction and for weather, cold and bright and indifferent to the passage of human generations. The lava is the same lava, cooled and ancient and black in the moonlight. The lake, what remains of it, still catches the sky's reflection in its shallow water. And somewhere, in Oklahoma and Oregon, in the living communities that carry the name Maclax forward into a future that their ancestors could not have imagined, the story continues. Not as history, as life. Rest well wherever you are. The night is yours. The story will wait. There are other people in this story who have not yet received their full due in this telling. People whose presence shape the outcome in ways that go beyond what can be captured, in a narrative focused mainly on the military and political events. Let us spend some time with them. Let us spend some time with the people who were present, but who were not the ones making the decisions that history records. Frank Riddle came to the Klamath country in the 1850s as a young man from Kentucky, part of that great westward movement that transformed the interior of the continent in the second half of the 19th century. He was a hunter and a scout, a man of the frontier in the tradition that James Fenimore Cooper had romanticized, and that the actual West was in the process of making and unmaking in equal measure. He met Toby, whose Modoc name was Wynmar, which has been translated as strong-hearted woman or woman warrior, at some point in the early 1860s, and they married, which was a social act that placed them both in complicated positions in a region where the relationship between native and white communities was already tense and growing more so. The marriage was accepted within the Modoc community, where it was not unusual for individuals to establish relationships that crossed the boundaries between groups. It was somewhat less accepted in the settler community, where marriages between white men and native women were viewed with various degrees of suspicion and contempt, and where the children of such marriages occupied an ambiguous and often difficult social position. But Frank and Toby made their life together, and Frank's knowledge of and relationships with the Modoc made him invaluable as an interpreter and a mediator in the years before and during the war. He was a man who understood both worlds from the inside, who had lived in both, who had relationships in both, and who was therefore uniquely positioned to serve as a conduit between them. The work he did as an interpreter during the peace negotiations was skilled and careful and necessary, and it placed him in physical danger during the events of April 11 when the killing of the peace commissioners occurred. He survived by running, which is the correct thing to do when armed men begin shooting in the vicinity, and his survival was important because his knowledge and his relationships were needed in the aftermath of the war. After the war, Frank Riddle largely disappears from the historical record in the way that people who are not central actors in dramatic events tend to disappear. He continued to live in the Klamath country. He raised children with Toby. He continued to work as a guide and interpreter when that work was available. The drama of the Modoc War was the drama of his life, in the sense that it produced the most intense and consequential period of his particular contribution to the events of his time, but it was also an episode in a longer life that went on in the ordinary way that lives go on after episodes. He died in 1905. Toby Riddle, Wynmar, lived until 1920. She saw the 20th century arrive. She saw the automobile and the airplane and the radio. She saw the reservation system in the West go through the cycles of policy that characterized the period, the allotment of reservation land under the Dawes Act, the continued pressure toward assimilation, the occasional gestures toward reform. She saw her community diminished and surviving and holding on in Oklahoma and in Oregon in the ways that communities hold on when they have been through what the Modoc had been through. She was celebrated in her own time, at least in some quarters. Congress, in 1890, passed a bill granting her a pension in recognition of her services in saving Alfred Meacham's life during the events of the 11th of April, 1873. This was a recognition, however belated and limited, of the courage she had shown on that morning. It was also, perhaps, a recognition of the impossible position she had occupied throughout the conflict, a Modoc woman trying to prevent violence between a government that wanted to remove her people and a community that was fighting for its right to exist in its homeland. Her son Jeff Riddle, born in 1863 and therefore a child of about 10 during the war, grew up to write his own account of the Modoc War, published in 1914 under the title The Indian History of the Modoc War. This account drew on his mother's memory and on the oral traditions of the Modoc community, and it provided a perspective on the events that the military and government records simply could not contain. Jeff Riddle was not a professional historian, and his account has the qualities and the limitations of memoir and oral history. But it is indispensable for anyone who wants to understand what the war looked and felt like from inside the Modoc community, and it has been used by historians writing about the conflict ever since its publication. The newspaper correspondents who covered the Modoc War deserve a moment's attention as well. The conflict attracted more press coverage than most of the Indian wars of the period, for several reasons. The military disasters of the January assault were dramatic and unusual enough to generate sustained national interest. The Peace Commission and the killing of the commissioners on April 11 produced a story that had all the elements of sensation, and the extended character of the siege, the months in which 50 warriors held the army at bay, made the conflict into a narrative with the kind of duration and suspense that sustained readers' interest. Several major newspapers sent correspondents to Northern California, and their dispatches, written under conditions that were often difficult and sometimes dangerous, form a significant part of the primary record of the conflict. The correspondents were not neutral. Their work was shaped by the assumptions of their time and their publications, and some of them were quite hostile to the Modoc, but some of them were also genuinely curious, genuinely interested in understanding the situation beyond the simple narrative of savage attack and heroic defense, and their dispatches occasionally rise to something more complicated and more honest than the period's general level of discourse about native peoples would suggest was possible. The correspondents who interviewed Captain Jack, who sat down with him through interpreters and tried to understand what he was saying and why, were doing something that was not standard practice for the press of the period, and the accounts they produced, however imperfect, give us access to Captain Jack's perspective that would otherwise be almost entirely absent from the record. The army officers who served in the Modoc War left their own records in the form of after-action reports and personal letters, and, for a few of them, memoirs written years later. These records are valuable precisely because they are honest about the difficulties and the failures of the army's position, because military officers, writing for each other and for their superiors, have certain incentives toward accuracy that are different from the incentives that shape public communications. The reports of the January assault, in particular, are striking for their directness about what went wrong and why. Their acknowledgement that the terrain had defeated the attack more than the Modoc's military skill, though that skill was also noted and respected in the best of these accounts. The army officers who fought the Modoc War, whatever their opinions about the justice of the cause they were pursuing, generally had a respect for the Modoc as fighters that comes through clearly in the record. Captain James Jackson, who led the initial detachment to Captain Jack's camp on the 29th of November, 1872, was a complicated figure. He was following orders, and the orders he was following were orders to return the Modoc to the reservation by persuasion, if possible, and by force, if necessary. The ambiguity in those orders, the judgment it required to decide when persuasion had failed and force was appropriate, was ambiguity that the military command structure was pushing onto the officer in the field, and Jackson resolved that ambiguity in the direction of force at a moment when a more patient and better prepared approach might have produced a different outcome. Whether Jackson deserves personal blame for the outcome of November 29 is a question that historians have argued about, and the argument is not simple. He was in a situation that was made difficult by factors well above his pay grade, and the decisions he made were within the range of what his orders allowed, however unfortunate their consequences. General Canby, the man who was killed on April 11, was a more senior figure with a more complex role in the story. He was a careful and humane officer by the standards of the period, someone who had a reputation for dealing fairly with native peoples in the various assignments he had held throughout his career. His decision to join the Peace Commission as its military representative was not an act of naivety, despite what the outcome might suggest. He understood the risk, and he accepted it because he believed that his presence added something that a senior military figure participating in the negotiations sent a signal about the seriousness with which the army and the government were approaching the process. He was right about the signal, he was wrong about the safety, and he paid for that with his life on a cold morning in the lava beds of Northern California. The death of General Canby produced grief in the army that was real and personal, not simply institutional. He was liked by the officers and men who served under him. He was known as a fair and decent man. The anger that his death produced in the military community and the determination it generated to bring the Modoc War to a conclusive end, regardless of the cost, were human responses to a human loss, as much as they were institutional responses to the killing of a commanding officer. Understanding that does not justify the military tribunal or the execution or the treatment of the Modoc dead. It does help explain the emotional temperature of the months following April 11, the intensity with which the army pursued the conclusion of the war. Reverend Eleazar Thomas, who died on the same morning as General Canby, is the least remembered of the Peace Commission's members, perhaps because his death was the most symbolically charged and therefore the most difficult to think about, without either sentimentalizing it or using it instrumentally. He was a minister, a religious man who believed in the power of good faith and direct human contact to bridge the distances between people who were in conflict. He brought those beliefs to the lava beds, and they were not sufficient protection against Boston Charlie's knife. His death was used, in the immediate aftermath of the killings, as evidence that the Modoc were irredeemably hostile, that no good faith negotiation was possible with them, that the military solution was the only one available. This use of his death, whatever its political utility, was a simplification of a more complicated reality. Thomas died because he went where he believed he needed to go, in circumstances that were dangerous, in pursuit of a goal that was worth pursuing. That his death produced consequences that he would not have endorsed is one of the genuine tragedies of the situation. A good man's sacrifice used for purposes that contradicted everything he had gone to the lava beds to accomplish. The Modoc War ended in June of 1873 with Captain Jack's capture, but the effects of the war did not end in 1873. They rippled forward through time in the way that consequential events always do, shaping the conditions of the people who came after, producing the communities and the landscapes and the political realities that the present has inherited. The Modoc people in Oklahoma and Oregon today are the end result of a chain of causes that includes the war, but the chain is long and its links are not all the same. There were people in it who made good choices and people who made terrible ones. There were moments of genuine care and moments of profound indifference. There were the ordinary people, the women and the children and the elders, who did not choose the war and did not choose the exile, but who lived through both and who kept their community alive, because that is what human beings do in the face of catastrophe when they have each other. The Modoc language, as I mentioned before, is at serious risk of being lost to future generations, but it is not yet lost. There are recordings made with fluent speakers in the 20th century that preserve the sound and the grammar and the vocabulary of the language. There are people in both Oklahoma and Oregon who are working with those recordings and with the few remaining speakers to teach the language to children and young adults who want to know it. The language is still being spoken. The songs are still being sung. The ceremonies, adapted to the circumstances of people who live in Oklahoma or on the Klamath Reservation rather than in the lava bed country, are still being performed. The Modoc are still Modoc. That persistence in the face of the sustained and systematic assault on Modoc identity and culture that began with the Treaty of 1864 and that continued, in various forms, for much of the century that followed, is one of the most remarkable facts of this entire story. It is remarkable not because it is exceptional, because it is not, because it is what indigenous communities throughout the Americas and throughout the world have done in the face of similar or greater assaults. It is remarkable because it requires us to understand survival as an active achievement, not a passive outcome. Staying Modoc in the conditions of the Kintpuash Reservation in Oklahoma in 1885, or the Klamath Reservation in Oregon in 1955, after termination had stripped away the tribe's federal recognition, required choice and effort, and the sustained maintenance of the relationships and the practices and the language that carried Modoc identity forward. The people who did that work deserve to be recognized for the achievement it was. The descendants of the Modoc who fought in the stronghold in 1873 are alive. They have names, they have jobs and families and opinions about politics and music and food. They have relationships with the land, some of them, that are expressed in the formal mechanisms of tribal governance and natural resource management, and others that are more personal, more private, more a matter of the feeling that attaches to a particular landscape when you know it is the landscape your ancestors fought for and loved and lost and partially returned to. They carry the story in ways that are not always visible to the outside world, in the way that all family histories are carried, not only in the public ceremonies and the published accounts, but in the private moments, the conversations at family tables, the things that are passed from one generation to the next, in the language of daily life. The volcanic plateau still does what volcanoes do. It sits, it waits. The geologists who study the Medicine Lake volcanic highland, which underlies the lava beds and a much larger area to the south, believe that it is dormant but not extinct, that the volcanic system is not finished with this landscape, that at some point in the future it will produce another eruption, another flow of basaltic lava across the plateau. On the geological timescale, this is not a distant event. On the human timescale, it may be many lifetimes away. The people who live in the region, like the Modoc before them, live in the shadow of the volcano without most of them thinking about it very much. The way people live next to rivers that flood or in earthquake zones, with the quiet background knowledge of the Earth's capacity for sudden radical change, and the daily practice of living as if it will not change today. The sky over the lava beds at night, away from the light pollution of the cities to the south and west, is extraordinary. It is the kind of sky that is difficult to see in the 21st century, a sky full of stars in numbers that city dwellers have forgotten were there. The Milky Way visible as a band of light across the darkness, the individual stars sharp and bright and numerous beyond easy counting. This is the sky that the Modoc people lived under. This is the sky that the warriors in the stronghold looked up at when the fighting paused and the night was quiet enough to notice it. This is the sky that the elders read for weather and direction and the passage of the seasons, the sky that was the ceiling of the world they knew. Looking up at that sky, it is possible to feel the particular kind of smallness that is not diminishing but clarifying, the smallness of a single human life against the scale of time and space that the night sky makes visible. Captain Jack's life, from its beginning somewhere around 1837 to its end in October of 1873, was 36 years or so in a place that had been inhabited for thousands of years, on a planet that had been cooling and shifting for billions. The war he fought lasted 6 months. The exile of his people lasted decades. The recovery is still ongoing. Against the geological time of the lava beds, all of this is very recent, very immediate, barely a mark on the surface of the rock, and yet it matters. The smallness of human lives against cosmic time does not diminish their significance within human time, within the scale at which human experience and human justice operate. What happened to the Modoc happened to people whose suffering was real, and whose loss was real, and whose descendants are real, and whose story deserves to be told and known and remembered. The vastness of the universe does not make the question of how we treat each other irrelevant. If anything, the brevity of human life against the backdrop of deep time makes the quality of that life, the justice or injustice of the conditions under which people live it, more important rather than less. We have so little time. It matters what we do with it, and it matters how we treat each other in it. The Modoc had a way of measuring their days and their seasons that was tied to the specific patterns of the landscape they inhabited. The arrival of the fish runs, the blooming of the camas, the movement of the migratory birds, the first frost and the last frost, the angle of the light in late afternoon in October, which told them that winter was coming and the preparations for the cold season needed to be complete. This system of temporal reckoning, embedded in the ecology of the volcanic plateau, was another form of knowledge that the exile disrupted, because the ecology of northeastern Oklahoma does not run on the same rhythms as the lava bed country, and the patterns that had oriented the Modoc in time were no longer visible in the landscape around them. Adapting to this temporal disruption was part of the larger adaptation that exile required, and it is a dimension of the loss that is easy to overlook in accounts that focus on the more measurable forms of dispossession. The songs that oriented the Modoc in time, the seasonal songs that marked the beginning of the fishing season, or the harvest of the camas, or the arrival of the geese, carried within their words and their rhythms the temporal knowledge of the plateau. When those songs were sung in Oklahoma, they invoked a landscape that was not present, called up a calendar that was tied to conditions that no longer surrounded the singers. This is a particular kind of grief, the grief of a seasonal knowledge that has been severed from the season it was built for, a grief that is quiet and persistent, and that lives in the moments when the expected cue does not arrive, when the fish do not run because there is no Tula Lake to run in, when the camas does not bloom because the meadows of the volcanic plateau are 1,000 miles away. Rest now. This is as deep as the story goes for one night, as many turns as the telling can reasonably take before the need for sleep becomes more pressing than the need for more story. The Modoc are known to you now, at least more fully than they were when this telling began, at least in enough of their particularity that the name means something, that the lava beds are not simply a geological feature, but a place where something happened that deserves to be remembered. The breathing has slowed. The world outside is quiet, or nearly so, whatever quiet is possible in the place where you are. The stars are up, whether you can see them or not. The same stars that the Modoc saw from the rim of the plateau, the same stars that looked down on the stronghold in the winter of 1873, the same stars that have been there through all the centuries of Modoc life in the lava bed country, and through all the years of exile and all the work of return. The story is complete. Let it settle now. Whatever part of it has reached you, whatever images or names or moments have lodged themselves in the place where stories go when they are received in the small hours of the night. Captain Jack, Kintpuash, the man with the brass-buttoned jacket who understood his situation clearly and could not save himself from it. Toby Riddle, the strong-hearted woman who tried to prevent the killing and saved the life of the man being killed. The children in the stronghold who heard the artillery. The fish in Tule Lake. The Tule reeds. The twisted volcanic rock under an enormous sky. Sleep. The story holds them all. There is one more thread to follow before the night is done. One more corner of this story that has not yet been fully illuminated. It is the thread of the land itself, not the geology and not the ecology, but the land as the Modoc understood it to be alive, to be populated with presences and relationships that were not visible to the American surveyors and soldiers and Indian agents who moved through the same terrain, but saw it as empty, as undifferentiated space waiting to be assigned a use. The lava beds were not empty to the Modoc. Every significant feature of the landscape had a name, and in that name was encoded knowledge about the feature's character and its history, and its relationship to the other features around it. The caves in the lava beds, some of which were large enough to shelter considerable numbers of people, had names that told the Modoc where they were in relation to other landmarks, what they had been used for in the past, what care was needed in approaching or using them. The springs and the seeps where water came to the surface in the otherwise dry volcanic terrain had names that also carried practical information about the reliability of the water, the quality of it, the best time of year to find it. The routes through the twisted rock had names that were also directions, ways of telling someone how to move from one place to another across terrain that had no obvious landmarks, and that could be deeply disorienting to anyone who did not already know it. This naming was not merely practical, though it was practical. it was also the way in which the landscape was understood to be a community of relationships rather than a collection of resources. The places had their own identities, their own histories, their own significance within the larger web of Modoc life and Modoc understanding. The stronghold, the place where Captain Jack's people made their stand, was not simply a useful defensive position. It was a place with a name in the Modoc language, a place that had been known and used for generations before the war, a place that was part of the landscape community that the Modoc inhabited. When the army officers mapped the lava beds, they gave the features names that were useful for military purposes, names that communicated position and relative elevation and tactical significance. The army names replaced the Modoc names in the official record, in the maps that were produced during and after the war, in the historical accounts that drew on those maps. The Modoc names survived in the community's memory and in whatever documentation of the language had been made before and during the reservation period. The work of recovering those names, of putting them back in the landscape, is part of the broader work of Modoc cultural recovery that the tribal communities are engaged in. A landscape that is named in a language is a landscape that is known in that language, and knowing it in that language is different from knowing it in any other. The English names that the army put on the features of the lava beds communicated certain things very efficiently, things about military utility and geographic position within the frame of reference that army maps used. They did not communicate what the Modoc names communicated, the histories and the relationships and the character of the places as understood by people who had lived among them for generations. Both sets of names are true in the sense that they accurately refer to the same places. They are not equivalent in what they carry, in what they preserve and transmit about the world they name. The Modoc language itself has a quality that linguists who have studied it describe as unusually precise in its description of the natural world, particularly in its vocabulary for landscape features and for the behavior of water and weather. This precision makes sense for a language that developed among people whose survival depended on their ability to read the landscape and the weather with great accuracy, who could not afford the bluntness of terms that did not distinguish between conditions that required different responses. The vocabulary for water, for the states and movements of water in a lake basin environment, is extensive and specific in ways that English does not match, because English did not develop among people who needed to know exactly what the water was doing in a shallow volcanic lake in order to make correct decisions about where to fish and when. The Modoc language developed among people for whom these distinctions were the difference between eating and not eating, and the language reflects that need in its structure and its vocabulary. The loss of a language is the loss of a particular way of knowing the world, not just the loss of a set of labels for things that can be just as well labeled in another language. The things that the Modoc language knows about the volcanic plateau, the things that are encoded in its vocabulary and its grammar and its patterns of metaphor, cannot all be translated into English without something being lost in the translation. Some of it can be approximated, some of it can be explained, but the full knowing, the knowing that comes from using the language to describe the world as you move through it, the knowing that is embedded in the language itself rather than in any description of the language, that knowing is only available in the language, and when the language is no longer spoken by people who live in the landscape it was made for, that knowing becomes inaccessible in ways that are very difficult to recover. This is why the language revitalization work that both Modoc communities are engaged in matters beyond the cultural and the symbolic, though it matters on those levels too. It matters because the knowledge it carries is real and specific, and practically relevant to the management of the landscape the Modoc came from. A landscape that is, as I mentioned earlier, in ecological distress, that reflects in part the loss of the management knowledge that the Modoc possessed. Restoring the language is not only an act of cultural justice, though it is that. It is also, potentially, a contribution to the practical knowledge base that the management of the Klamath Basin needs if it is going to address the problems that a century of ecologically uninformed management has created. The fish are still there. The lost river suckers and the short-nosed suckers that are listed as endangered are the same species that the Modoc harvested for generations, the same species that were at the center of the Modoc economy and the Modoc diet. Their endangerment is the result of habitat degradation, of the changes to water temperature and water quality, and the physical character of the streams and lake basins that were once their habitat. Changes that began with the drainage projects and the irrigation development that followed the removal of the Modoc from the basin. Restoring the fish means, to some significant degree, restoring the habitat conditions that the Modoc landscape management maintained, the shallow lake margins and the spring-fed tributaries, and the natural water temperature regime that allowed the suckers to reproduce and thrive. The tribal fisheries management programs of the Klamath tribes, which draw on both Western ecological science and indigenous ecological knowledge, are working toward that restoration in ways that the federal and state agencies are increasingly recognizing as valuable partners in the effort. The story of the Modoc War is, in this way, not only a story about the past, it is a story that has consequences in the present that are visible in the water levels of Tule Lake and in the population counts of endangered fish and in the political negotiations over water rights in a basin where too many users are competing for too little water in the context of a climate that is becoming drier as the temperature rises. The removal of the Modoc from their landscape set in motion a chain of consequences that continues to unfold. And the partial return of the Modoc to a role in the management of that landscape is one of the factors that, if it is adequately supported and resourced, might contribute to a better outcome for the basin and for all the people and other species that depend on it. The night is very deep now, and the story is very long, and there is a kind of peace that settles around a story that has been told as fully as a single night allows. The Modoc War is known to you. The lava beds are in the mind. The name Kintpuash has been said, and behind it the person who bore it, the man who grew up fishing and hunting in the volcanic country of Northern California, who went to Eureka and saw what was coming, who tried to protect his people in the only ways available to him, and who ultimately could not. His failure was not a personal failure. It was the failure that the situation guaranteed, the failure of insufficient force against overwhelming force, the failure of political intelligence against political power, the failure of a man who was right about what needed to happen against a system that was not interested in what needed to happen. The moon, if there is a moon tonight, has crossed most of the sky by now. The stars have wheeled in their slow arc from east to west. Somewhere in the lava beds, if you could be there, the rock would be cold under your hands, and the silence would be the deep silence of a landscape, with no city noise, only the occasional sound of an animal moving, or the wind crossing the plateau from the north. This is the silence that the Modoc fighters occupied in the winter of 1873. The silence between the artillery rounds and the rifle fire. The silence that told them the army was not attacking tonight, that they had another night in the stronghold, another day of defense ahead of them. It was a silence earned by their skill and their knowledge and their willingness to hold the line for their families. It is still there, if you go looking for it, in the quiet places of the lava beds where the tourists do not always go, in the hours before the dawn when the birds have not yet started and the wind has not yet risen and the volcanic rock is simply itself, cold and old and patient. Sleep. The story is done. The night is yours. One last thing, before the night fully closes. There is a word in the Modoc language for the feeling that comes when you are in a place you know very well, a place that has been part of your life for so long, that it feels like an extension of yourself, rather than a separate thing. The scholars who have worked on the Modoc language have documented something like this, a vocabulary for the relationship between person and place that goes beyond simple familiarity into something that might be called belonging in the deepest sense. Not belonging in the sense of ownership, but belonging in the sense of being part of something, being native to a specific piece of the earth, in the way that the Tule reeds are native to the margins of Tule Lake, the way the suckers are native to the cold springs that feed the lost river, the way the ravens are native to the rimrock above the lava beds, always present, always themselves, always of this particular place. Captain Jack belonged to the lava bed country in that sense. Kintpuash belonged to it. The people who followed him into the stronghold belonged to it. They did not own it in any legal sense that the American government recognized, but they were of it in a way that the American government's categories had no language for, no framework to accommodate, no mechanism to honor. And that inability, the inability of the American legal and political system of 1873 to recognize and accommodate this kind of belonging, was one of the fundamental causes of everything that followed. Not the only cause, but a fundamental one. We are better, now, at recognizing this kind of belonging, at least in principle. The legal frameworks that govern the relationship between tribal nations and the federal government have evolved significantly since 1873, however imperfectly and however incompletely. The principle that indigenous peoples have rights to their traditional territories and to the resources within them, rights that do not simply evaporate when those territories are surrounded by the territory of a more powerful nation, is more firmly established in international law and in American law than it was when the Modoc War was fought. The practice, as always, lags behind the principle. The negotiations over water rights and fishing rights in the Klamath Basin are evidence of that lag. But the principle is there, and it was not there in 1873. The belonging continues. The lava beds still exist, the people still exist, the language is still being spoken, however few the speakers, the songs are still being sung, the memory is still being carried, generation to generation, in the communities in Oklahoma and Oregon that are still, after everything, Modoc. The story that began on the shores of Two Lake, in the centuries before any written record reaches, is not over. It is only at a particular point in its unfolding, the point that the present always is, the point from which the past can be seen and the future can only be hoped toward. That is where we leave it tonight. At the present, which is where we always are, with the past as rich and as complex and as painful as this telling has tried to convey, and the future as open as the enormous sky above the volcanic plateau, as open as the life of the communities who carry this story forward in the ordinary, extraordinary way that people carry their histories forward, day by day, story by story, breath by breath. Rest now, the night is complete, the story holds. The lava beds will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and long after the names of the people who argued over them have faded from living memory into the written record. The rock endures. And in the rock, in the particular volcanic black of the basalt, and in the shape of the pressure ridges, and in the natural trenches that the cooling lava formed, the evidence of everything that happened here is preserved as clearly as in any document. Go there if you can. Walk the stronghold. Stand in the places where the Modoc stood. Let the landscape tell you what it knows. It has been waiting a long time to be heard.